Welcome to our symposium celebrating the 200th birthday of our Arkansas territory. A few things I want to tell you about before we get started. We're going to have lunch at 12 today, and if you're a teacher and you're interested in getting continuing education credit, we have forms for you to take home with you. I'm going to tell you a little about our first speaker is Dr. Charles Bolton. He grew up and went to college in upstate New York, earned a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and taught history at UA Little Rock from 1973 to 2008. By my count, that's 35 years. That's pretty impressive. He's published 2 books on early Arkansas history: Territorial Ambition, Land Society in Arkansas, 1800 to 1840, and Arkansas, 1820 to 1860, Remote and Restless. And he's got a new book, Fugitivism, Escaping Slavery in the Lower Mississippi, 1820 to 1860. So if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Bolton.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be here. Federal funding and the infrastructure. Is this better? Okay. Okay. I can just push this down and that'll turn it right. Yeah, good. Okay. So this is good for me too. I don't have a booming voice. So yes, that's the title. I want to begin by talking about the relationship between infrastructure and the federal government in the early 19th century. I use the term infrastructure and internal improvements pretty much in the same, to mean basically the same thing. Internal improvements was the name that was used really from, throughout this period, almost from the Revolution down to the Civil War. And basically, internal improvements meant changes, modernization, creation of really transportation networks, roads, canals, bridges, and eventually trains as well. All of those were internal improvements, and they were really vital to the country, not only in the East, but also particularly because Americans were moving west, and there simply were no roads. In Arkansas, no roads in 1819 worthy of the name. Now, federal funding for internal improvements was a problem, a constitutional problem, because there is no specific authorization in the Constitution. Now, the Federalists, George Washington and his allies, for them, it wasn't really a problem. I think they thought in terms of the preamble, which said that part of the job of the new government was to promote the general welfare. And the general welfare, at this point, obviously included these improvements. But Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were concerned, of course, about the enlargement of the Constitution. So they were much more what we today call originalists, that is, staying close to what the Constitution said. Jefferson was interested in transportation improvements. He recognized the need for them, but he felt a constitutional amendment was necessary, and that never happened. Andrew Jackson was more hostile. I'm sure Jackson was concerned about the Constitution, but Andrew Jackson and the entire Democratic Party, as a result, was very concerned about the encroachment, well, really the growth of federal authority, what Jackson would have said a concentration of power in the central government. So that made all of this very difficult. Some changes were made. John C. Calhoun, as the Secretary of War in the Monroe administration, was anxious to find a way to build roads and all this stuff. He was in his nationalist phase at that point. And he came up with this idea that was embodied in the General Survey Act of 1824. What Calhoun said basically was that if you build a road for defensive purposes, a military road as they came to be called, they were also perfectly useful for civilian purposes, like a mail route, for example, or purposes of commerce. Now, he emphasized the military uses, but actually what Calhoun wanted to achieve was the opposite. He wanted to build civilian roads based on the power of the government to over defense. And actually that worked out to a certain degree. The General Survey Act authorized the president to use the Army Corps of Engineers, which were basically all the trained engineers in the United States in this period. It authorized the president to use them to survey roads. In practice, at least in the West, engineers came to sort of manage the work, as they do today. They hire contractors, but they oversee the project. Now, all of that is sort of background in a way, but necessary for at least the overall perspective on this, because internal improvements in Arkansas Territory were not a constitutional problem. The Constitution gives Congress specific authority over federal territories to govern them, and with that comes a responsibility to spend whatever money Congress is willing to spend. It's not obligated to build roads, but kind of needs to be done. Now that brings us to what actually happened in Arkansas. And really the critical thing was money spent on roads. And this list, I hope, yes, you can see as well as I can, Little Rock to Fort Gibson, Little Rock to Columbia, which is near present-day Lake Village, Fort Smith to Fort Townsend out there in Indian Territory, and then that road also went down into Louisiana. Jackson is up near, well, it was in Lawrence County, or was then, and that road went down to Old Washington, sort of continuing the Southwest Trail. Strong's on the St. Francis River. William Strong had a house there and operated a ferry, and there was a branch road that went up to Batesville. Now, the giant appropriation went for a road from Little Rock to Memphis, as many of you probably know. Water projects were also important. The Corps also had responsibility for inland navigation. I guess I didn't mention that, but that developed really after the Supreme Court case in 1824, Gibbons v. Ogden, in which John Marshall expanded the meaning of interstate commerce. It wasn't just selling stuff from one state, making stuff in one state, selling it someplace else. Marshall basically defined it as intercourse, that any sort of movement between states was interstate commerce, and therefore the federal government had authority over inland waters under its authority over interstate commerce. Out of that grew massive projects in the lower Mississippi Valley where navigation became tremendously important. Arkansas benefited from all of that, but specifically $35,000 was spent improving navigation on the Arkansas River. But the big thing was this Red River Raft, which was cleared away between 1833, 1838. Relative to all of this, I've got this, $1 in 1835 is, as a result of inflation, it's $116 in 2018. That really doesn't get at the meaning of all of this. 74.4 million was a big chunk of money. The federal government was operating at about $18 million a year in this period. So that's, in the territorial period, I think $316 million. So, $500,000 wasn't chump change by any means. I was not sure how this map would work, the way it's black and white and very busy, but maybe you can see the network of roads that, if you look at Little Rock in the center of the state, you can see these roads radiating out of there, although you can't see them very well. So let me try to do a little better with that. The road I'm really interested in is the Memphis to Little Rock Road, and that starts over there at the right of your screen at Memphis, and then moves west through that shaded area, which basically represents what we call the Mississippi Swamp. In fact, I think that swamp, or at least swampy land, extended well to the east. I think when you left Memphis in relatively few miles, you were in very wet terrain. So I'll come back to in just a minute the area between Memphis and what's labeled Francisville on the map. It's just at the end of that swampy land. And basically it's Memphis to the St. Francis River. That's that boundary. That's the St. Francis River that forms the western boundary of Crittenden County, or at least it did. Then after St. Francisville, the road arcs down to Clarendon and crosses the White River there. That slant to the southwest was an improvement over the original survey, which went directly west. It takes up more, it adds to the mileage, but it avoids swampy land at the White River and made the road a lot easier to develop. Now, from Clarendon to Little Rock is basically not a problem. I mean, it's level land, it's dry, and building a road through there was not an issue. I mean, the big, I don't know what they spent, actually somewhat more than $20,000, I think, on that part of the road, but it wasn't a big problem. The other part, this area from Memphis to St. Francisville was a major problem. The first Memphis to Little Rock Road was built between 1824 and 1828, but this part of it washed out relatively quickly, and eventually the government agreed to spend a couple of $100,000 building a road through that area. Now the road, that road was a, well, okay, it was a big deal. Basically, the engineer who resurveyed that noted that the flooding, the water that filled that swamp came from flooding from the north, from the New Madrid area. The Arkansas River overflowed a couple of times a year, in the fall and the spring, and basically water came over the banks in the New Madrid area and then flowed south down past Memphis and down on toward Helena. And that basically was what washed out the road. So this guy, his name was Howard, and he wrote a long report on this, which I think is a fascinating document. Anyway, the deal was, he said, what you had to do was build an embankment, which is basically a levee. That's what needed to be done. 40 miles of this embankment, and that the embankment would go east-west. You know, we think of levees along the Mississippi from north to south, but in this case, the embankment would go from east to west to deal with that flooding that came from the north. And the road itself was to be built on top of the embankment. Basically, it was a levee, you know, with sloped sides and then a flat top. In this case, the flat top would be about 25 feet wide. And then there was, you know, then there was that sloping, what we call a berm today. The embankment in some places would be a foot high. In other places, it would be up to 5 feet high. And then it would have to have, it was cut in certain places, regular places rather close together, and there were bridges built over that so that the water coming south would flow under the bridge and go on. So it wasn't a levee to keep out water, it was to raise the road above the water and let the water flow under rather than over. The other really big deal, I guess what I should say also, that road was begun as a separate project in 1834, and the work was continued up till 1838 when they finally ran out of money. And ultimately, at that point, after Arkansas became a state, there were still 16 miles of road that needed to be built, and they estimated it would be another $100,000 to do that. So we're talking about a massive project, and I'll come back to what happens to that. The Red River Raft was roughly 140 miles or so of tangled, well, there were logs, there were trees growing up in the river, there was vegetation over that, and it basically totally blocked any navigation of the Red River. And now we're talking about steamboats, steamboat navigation, which was critical to the economy. Henry Shreve, who I imagine you've heard of. In any case, Shreveport is named for him. Henry Shreve developed this vessel called a snag boat, which operated on the Mississippi and also the tributaries. The front of the steamboat had this kind of V-shaped thing with a prow on either side, and then that winch. But what it would do is this interesting thing. It would, there'd be a tree or something in the river, and the boat would just hit that tree, catch it between that front area and just hit it, and then back up and hit it again, and then hit it again. And eventually, when it was loose enough, they'd get chains around it and winch it up, and then saw the logs. It was the same thing with logs or the stumps or whatever. They'd saw those and I guess let them float down the river or put them up creeks or something. But basically, it was it was a big deal, both all over the Mississippi Valley, but particularly for Arkansas because of what it did in the Southwest. Well, here, the raft kept developing over time. It basically moved backwards up the Red River. Red River has sandy banks, and these trees would grow up, and then when flooded, they'd fall into it. This is in the 1870s, and my sense of it is that the original Red River raft was far more dense, that it was open. I think you could pretty much walk on that original raft. Now, here is where the raft is. You see the Red River here enters Arkansas and then comes around here and flows into Louisiana and then across to the Mississippi River. So Steamboat Transportation, well, actually you could even do it with flatboats, but anyway, you can get cotton out of southwestern Arkansas once you have that river open. And what that did was to allow the Southwest Arkansas to develop cotton plantations and become tremendously important in the Arkansas economy. This article from the Arkansas Gazette in 1835 is taken from an advertisement for town lots in Fulton, Arkansas. And I should have shown, Fulton, Arkansas is basically where traffic from Arkansas on its way to Texas comes over the Red River. So Fulton was the port that southwestern Arkansas planters would take their cotton to. And once that opened up, then the price of land, went up, and people who had bought land earlier could sell it, basically. I've highlighted the enterprising superintendent up there. That's Henry Shreve. And it says, he has recently said that he will be able to send a steamboat to Long Prairie, which is just a little west of Fulton. 25 miles above the raft during the present spring. And then this goes on to say, there's no section of the country west of the Mississippi increasing more rapidly in population and wealth than that portion of Arkansas bordering on the Red River. That may be an exaggeration. The guy's trying to sell land, but nonetheless, it was an extremely important aspect of Arkansas economic development, all owing to federal spending. This, of course, is the old Statehouse. I think this is pictures taken during the federal occupation in the 1860s. But it's still a pretty amazing structure and of course a durable one, which we can still go to. There are, I'm sure, people here who know a whole lot more about the State House than I do, but here's some basic things. It was originally financed by the government. Well, I don't know what that, okay. And by this point, the federal government had begun to finance internal improvements, not by giving money to the states, but rather giving federal land to the states that they could sell and keep the proceeds. Again, that was John C. Calhoun's idea, around 1840. Well, I guess it must have begun earlier. But anyway, that was a way of getting around the constitutional problem. And in fact, as you probably know, that also allowed transcontinental railroads to be built. I mean, the government provided land and funded all of that. Those hardy Western planters and cattlemen, basically, out west, and hardy individualists are there because of federal spending on railroads. I mean, that's what opened the West, of course. Anyway, so here's what happened in Arkansas. We got 6,400 acres. Secretary Crittenden, who's like the assistant governor, decided that the best way to build a state house was for the legislature to give him the 6,400 acres, and in return, he would give Arkansas his brick home in Little Rock, which could be a state house. And the legislature agreed. There was some question of bribery and whatever, but the legislature agreed. John Pope, who was governor of Arkansas, federally appointed governor, said, no, we're not going to do that. He vetoed the measure and then got Congress to put him in charge of the project. So he sold the land, got $25,000, way more than what Crittenden's house was worth. Pope chose the site, which I think we can agree was a good place, and he hired this architect from Kentucky, Shyrock, who had a national reputation, and they began work on the State House. It actually cost a whole lot more money, and the government put up more land to make that happen. The Arkansas legislature, though, now this is the state legislature, kicked in, as I say, $37,000, which is a significant amount out of the 123,000. I want to emphasize that because, as far as I know, that's the largest and one of the few cases in which Arkansas paid for its own internal improvements down to 1860. Just didn't happen. And here it is. The federal funding stopped in 1836. Arkansas was a state. It was now responsible for its own improvements. They continued to work on the road until 1838 because that was when the last amount of funding ran out. After that, nothing substantial was done on that road. Arkansas might, yikes. Arkansas might have funded that project, but the first thing, it's okay. Yeah. The first thing that the Arkansas legislature did relative to money was to create two banks, state banks. One, a real estate bank, which was raised capital by allowing people to, they raised capital based on land. It was a land bank, which really only benefited planters. And what you would do, you would use your land as collateral for loans. And eventually that's, within a couple of years, the other thing is they did something for everybody else by creating a state bank, which would take various types of federal funds which came into Arkansas and loan that money out as well. Well, over the next few years, a lot of loaning went on. Each of those banks, one more thing. The banks themselves they issued bonds, and the bonds became obligations of the state. So, it's basically like the Bank of America issuing bonds, and then Arkansas, if things went bad, Arkansas would have to pay. I mean, in retrospect, it's pretty crazy, and it was pretty crazy then. In any case, within a couple of years, Arkansas was in debt $3 or $4 million. Massive amount of money. And it actually it defaulted on one group of bonds, which hurt the state's credit for decades to come. But in any case, that made it, issuing bonds would have been a great way to fund the road and other internal improvements, but the state couldn't do that. And it also, population increased, things went well for Arkansas in the 1840s and 50s, but the state chose not to use revenue for anything other than the costs of maintaining the government, which didn't cost very, very much. So they kept taxes extremely low rather than getting more tax money to pay for important needs of the state. One other thing that happened, the government, again, in order to support internal improvements even for states, gave land to Arkansas and a number of other, particularly western states. So the sale of that land could have been used for internal improvements. But the state legislature decided that the best use of that land was to turn it over to the counties. So instead of one fund that the government could use for big projects, I don't know what happened to that land. Probably some levees, probably some ditching, probably some improvements on local roads, but really nothing in terms of the state as a whole. So the biggest problem, in a sense, was that the 16 miles of incomplete road was, as far as I know, never completed. It certainly wasn't completed down to the Civil War, and my understanding is that road was pretty miserable for a long time after. Federal internal improvements shifted to railroads, and Arkansas was still trying to get money for a dirt road, basically. I should say, and I'll stop with this, there did develop in the statehood period an important internal improvement movement, kind of lobby. The Whig Party in Arkansas was particularly positive about doing something about internal improvements. One of the big ideas was to get people in Memphis, which by that time was a rapidly growing city, becoming one of the major cities of the West. And there were people there who could have funded it. Arkansas made really a valiant effort for that, but ultimately it failed, and that's a whole nother story, so I will stop. And I don't know really how much time, if any. Oh, good, good. Okay, so I can either take a rest, or you can raise some questions, which, yeah.
Those appropriations that you showed in one of the earlier slides.
A what?
The appropriations that you showed?
Yeah.
What year was that?
That was the total appropriations for
Over time.
each of those projects down to 1836,
Okay.
basically. Yep.
So, based on that, like by 1860, what was the state of the transportation system in Arkansas? What was it looking like, roads and
Miserable.
rivers?
Miserable. And part of that was that, in a sense, Arkansas didn't really need roads because of its river system. And the fact there was that the Arkansas economy was based largely on cotton plantations, and cotton plantations were always located near water transportation. So you grow cotton and you take it to Helena, or you can take it to Memphis, although the road wasn't good, or you could take it to Bolton. I mean, there were various. We could go down the Washita River to the Red River. And that's basically what planters needed, not just in Arkansas, but throughout the South. A plantation was a relatively, as you know, relatively self-contained operation. So planters did really quite well by taking their cotton to New Orleans and then buying what they needed, the big stuff anyway, in New Orleans, and bringing it back by steamboat. I mean, the steamboat basically made the lower Mississippi Valley Pike. Albert Pike was a big promoter of internal improvements and basically developed a big reputation throughout the South as a railroad innovator in a way. But Pike wrote a piece in 1851 that was absolutely devastating. He traveled in the East, and of course he was from the East as well, and then came back to Arkansas, and he was going to get involved in railroad promotion on behalf of the state, and that may have explained it. But he wrote this piece about Arkansas roads, basically talking about how horrible they were, and quite correctly, I think, and also about the fact that because of the roads, or the roads at least illustrated the economic backwardness of Arkansas. Although, we're producing a very large amount of wealth relative to cotton, but he wanted to see a kind of modernization of the economy. But anyway, there's this, in there, he talks about railroads and factories and all this stuff going on in the North and even by this time in the West, and he talks about how bad it makes Arkansas look. And what does he say? Arkansas is the slattern, which is a very negative statement for women. Arkansas is the slattern of the American states. I mean, it's a very nasty thing to say, but the larger point was pretty much accurate. You had a question, Jim.
Yes, sir. It's not technically infrastructure, but since you brought up Old Statehouse, I'm gonna ask, this wonderful building we're sitting in was built by the federal government in the same time period you're talking about. Could you put the federal spending for the arsenal in context with the other federal spending?
Somebody could. I don't know. When was the State House? When
The
was
arsenal was started in 1838.
Oh, you know, I think, well, basically, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm going to continue working on this project and I'll do something with that. I think it's not in these appropriations because that was a direct military aspect. It's a military project.
That's kind of what I thought, but I didn't know how that federal spending, if it had any relationship to the other federal spending at all.
Yeah, well,
was,
it benefited.
federal appropriation, it was not much.
Okay. Yeah.
Did anyone provide river maintenance since it was so critical for the 20 or 30 years they stopped doing improvements?
There's that $25,000, I think that was a figure for the Arkansas River. And I left it off, but there was an appropriation of $500 for the White and the St. Francis River. I don't know what, maybe they went up there and removed one big tree or something. But I think really navigation for people in Arkansas worked really quite well. I think the raft was the big problem. Navigation was always dangerous. Mississippi steamboats were highly dangerous things. And there were problems, but I don't think navigation caused any limitation or slowdown in terms of the development of the state.
And one more dumb one.
Sure.
When you use the word raft, does that mean a man-made cleared section of river? Is that what the word is being used as?
Good point. No, they use the term raft because it looked like a raft. And that's why I say that, one of the reasons why I say that I think it was much denser.
So the debris looked like a raft. And so they
Exactly,
called it a raft.
exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. And then the debris, there was vegetation growing over the debris, so I think you could walk across it. Maybe that's not the case, but.
About the only river navigation you have in the northwest corner is the Arkansas, some of the White, what about
No.
navigation in the northwestern part of the state?
Oh, in the northwestern part of the state? None. Yeah, none, except, as I remember, Van Buren was mainly the port for northwestern Arkansas.
Roseville and Spadra, there was a port at Spadra and at Russellville. But
Yeah.
But they were all on the Arkansas River. I can't find much going out into other areas, any other
Well,
streams.
That's a real big area. That's the Arkansas River Valley, which of course is a big farming area. Essentially, there are probably two reasons why there wasn't sort of plantation-like agriculture, say in Fayetteville and that Washington County area, which grew rapidly. Washington County was the most heavily populated county in Arkansas, but it was basically smaller type agriculture, and I should be able to tell you more about that. The fruit trees came later. But anyway, it was Arkansas, the Fayetteville area was probably the most, I don't know if I want to say modernized area, or anyway, it wasn't a plantation area, but somehow managed to be prosperous as well. And I should know more about that. I should know a lot of things which I don't. Yes, oh, so,
You
hi.
mentioned military roads, and I may have missed the time frame on that. I grew up in Helena, which is at the very tail end of Crowley's Ridge, and there's a military road that comes down that, which was right behind my house. So I don't know, was that back in territorial times?
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I meant to say something about it. After Calhoun convinced Congress to pass the General Survey Act, the Corps of Engineers started working on these roads, and there was this general idea that they would be used for military purposes.
What year was that?
Well, the General Survey Act was 1834, but from that point on, really down to the Civil War, engineers were building these roads, and all of them became known as, well, as military roads. They were appropriated. They said military road because that's how you got the money. My big deal about all this is that the road from Memphis to River Raft is sort of routinely talked about as the military road. Even people at the time recognized that it was basically a road to promote immigration and to promote as a way to get to the Memphis market. I'm sure they brought, I'm not even sure they brought very many troops over that road because I think they very quickly started taking them by steamboat to the west. The big thing, it's known as a military road and talked about largely in terms of the Trail of Tears. And the military road is not wrong, and the Trail of Tears is really important, but that road should be thought of as a civil works project that was focused on getting mail into and out of Arkansas and used to promote immigration. I mean, there's all kinds of concern in Arkansas in the territorial period that Arkansas isn't growing, but you couldn't get here. I mean, you could get here by steamboat, but a lot of people traveled by land in wagons and stuff, and it was very difficult. Until the 1850s, things improved in a way because then the locus in a way of, well, people crossed to Arkansas from Memphis throughout the period, but in the latter part of the period, Arkansas was settled by people, Southerners, coming west, as opposed to people from Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Ohio Valley. And Southerners coming west from Alabama crossed at Helena. So the Memphis road became somewhat less important. But fine, I mean, call it a military road in Helena. But again, I think that was.
I mean, we normally thought of it as having to do something with the Civil War, but I didn't realize it may have come about a lot earlier.
No, it was earlier.
Much
It was, yeah, I guess they were used as military roads during the Civil War, but not,
That wasn't why they were
nobody
built. It was a
did
lot.
it for that reason. Thank you. Oh, well,
Who were the laborers on these roads? Were they military people? Were they army people, or were they local
another
people?
good question. That's another difference about military roads. All the roads in Arkansas were built by civilian contractors under contracts let by the Corps of Engineers. The laborers, it's not always clear, but I think almost all of them were enslaved people rented out by their owners and paid by the government. Now, in Indian Territory, soldiers built the roads. So actually, the engineers tend to talk about federal roads. That's probably the best name for these. Then in the territories, they call them military roads. And I'm so sorry, I think I went over.
No, you're fine. With your answer.
Everybody?
You can keep going with your answer.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I think, yeah. No, I think there's a general agreement on their part and mine that it's pretty good.
Thank you. We're going to have a short 10-15 minute break, and then we'll have our next speaker. Let's get started up again. Our next speaker is Gary Pinkerton. He has a master's in social work degree from the University of Houston and a bachelor's degree in social work and psychology from Texas A&M University Commerce. He is a member of the editorial board for the East Texas Historical Association. His work also appears in the online Encyclopedia of Arkansas History and Culture, the online Handbook of Texas Portal to Texas History, and the Journal of Diving History. He is the author of 2 books, the Trammel Trace, The First Road to Texas from the North, which is, both of these books are for sale out in the next room. His second book is True Believers, Treasure Hunters at Hendricks Lane. So if you'd welcome Gary Pinkerton.
Did the maps make their way around? Did we get those passed out? There we go. Ding. I did not bring crayons, but I do have a nice map. It always helps to talk about this when you can see what we're talking about. Unlike Dr. Bolton, I have no credentials whatsoever to do what I'm doing. I am terminally curious and fairly tenacious. And when I learned that Trammel's Trace, this 200-year-old road, the first road into Texas from the north, early 1800s for Anglo use, came right through our property, I got a little interested. And in researching that, I learned that some famous people and a whole lot of immigrants came across our pasture. And so I started learning more about it. And when I did that, you know how you remember where you were when we landed on the moon or the Columbia explosion or World Trade? I remember where I was when Gail Martin, the archivist at the Southwest Regional Archive in Washington, called me to say, yes, we have the Dawson collection from the 1940s. James and Dawson and his wife did the only basic research on Trammel's Trace. There was a lot of myth and legend about it. Nicholas Trammel will talk a lot about, who was a Tennessean who came to Arkansas Missouri Territory in 1807, but nothing that really told the whole story. Nicholas Trammel, if you read what you saw on the internet back then, came across, he ran taverns, he came across this highwayman robber, and his tavern was like the Bates Motel. People would check in and they would never check out. Well, if you're running a gambling operation, that's a bad business practice, and it doesn't fit his personality. But Sarah and Gail has since passed away. Melissa Nesbitt there and Fatima at NERA have been a huge part of it and a big help in the research. And after emailing and talking to Elizabeth Freeman from Houston, I finally met her today. So this story is very much about Arkansas and how people came from Tennessee through Arkansas to get to Texas. Trammel's Trace is named in a multitude of maps, and most of the documentation of its route comes from the original Texas land surveys at the General Land Office. So when these original surveys were laid out, they would survey the boundaries, and survey calls would say 1,600 varas, which is the measure, a Spanish measure for distance. 1,600 varas from the northeast corner was Trammel's Trace, and it would name the road. The next survey down, which connected with that, wouldn't name it. It was also called the Pecan Point Road or the Jonesboro Road, the two earliest Anglo settlements on the Red River upstream from Fulton, fairly far near Fort Towson. And then this 1841 map of Arkansas showed where the road from Dooley's Ferry heading to the Red River settlements and Trammel's Trace crossed each other from the U.S. and Republic of Texas boundary survey in 1841. For that straight part of the Texas boundary from Logansport, essentially, along that parallel, they built an 8-foot tall mound of dirt with a 10-inch stake in the middle of it and a glass bottle with a note buried at the bottom. 8-foot tall mound of dirt every mile. So between 102 and 103 is where Trammel's Trace crossed along that second floodplain of the Red River. So we have a pretty good sense of where Trammel's Trace goes, and that's where that map came from. Dawson did much of the same thing, and that map is based on his initial work. He was a civil engineer, worked for the Texas Department of Transportation, so his drafting abilities came in handy. But it was great to hear Dr. Bolton's explanation about some of these roads, because I'm very familiar with the Southwest Trail and the roads into Old Washington. A lot of the early maps show 5 or 6 roads coming into Washington. It was the center of the universe on that jumping off point. And then the Great Bend of the Red River, where it makes a very sharp 90-degree turn at Fulton, is essentially where Trammel's Trace picked up. Military expenditures were used to push that road farther down to the limits of the U.S. territory and the Louisiana Purchase at that time. And on the other side of the river, people really weren't sure if that was Arkansas or Missouri or Spain or Mexico or the U.S. It really didn't know what that was, but people treated it as if they were entering another country. And that was a good plan. But the map in this drawing shows the northern part of this. Nicholas Trammel actually came into Missouri Territory in 1807 up near Batesville, and he and the Western Cherokee of Chief Bowles migrated together during the same time in geography and space. I found nothing that tied them together directly, but Trammel and the Cherokee were involved in a lot of trading ventures and some horse smuggling later on. His most famous location and his longest duration in Arkansas was east of Old Washington. There was a crossroads here where he had a tavern. There's a Caddo mound at that location now, and that's where he lived most of the time. He and his sons also lived down in Lost Prairie and had plantation. His sons were more plantation owners than they were tavern keepers. Trammel's Trace goes through 8 East Texas counties, just right along State Line Highway. There's a crossing. The Sulphur River is the boundary between Bowie and Cass County. That was Epperson's Ferry. This dotted line is that way because there's not that many survey calls that tell us where the trace was located at that point, but Trammel himself is attributed with cutting that trail. Pecan Point in Jonesboro. Pecan Point was the earliest Anglo settlement in Texas, and historians in Texas do not understand this. I was in the Bullock Museum of Texas History, which is an incredible place if you ever get the chance to go to Austin. And standing next to a giant white marble statue of Sam Houston, my favorite drunk, and a docent there, and I made some comment about, oh yeah, there's Houston, one of those latecomers to Texas. Mm-hmm. And she gave me that docent stink eye, but they really were. All the people that are considered the Texas heroes were very late in coming. These Anglo settlements along the Red River were 1815 through the 1820s, and they would dance on both sides of the river depending on who was after them or wanted to pay taxes. When they were on the north side of the Red River, they were in Indian territory, and U.S. soldiers came and burned their houses. So they would move to the south until the Spaniards discovered they were there and wanted to tax them. It was quite a ways from Nacogdoches, which was the only other Spanish presence. And then so they would move back on the other side. But Pecan Point played a very significant role in early Texas history. Crossing the Sulphur River there to the west side of Cass County, these roads connected. Hughes Springs, Texas is right about here. Across Marion County, Jefferson is right about there. And it takes this curve out to the east of the location of where Marshall is right now. Marshall didn't exist, but these Caddo villages did, even up into the early Republic of Texas years after 1836. And then there's that fairly distinct curve around for these villages. The trace was, Caddo trails for the most part that became adopted for later use, so it made sense that they followed no particular destination, but they would pass through those villages. Right where the trace crosses the Sabine is where Harrison, Rusk, and Panola County touch, and there's a significant outcropping of lignite coal that you could drive your car across. It was so hard, and so it was a natural crossing for hundreds of years, and a ferry crossing for a few years in the 1830s. When Rusk County was formed in 1843, 2/3 of the boundary with Panola was defined as Trammel's Trace. That's how significant a landmark it was, even up into this period where roads began to go everywhere as people settled and built farms. Our family land is right about where that E is right there. And from there down to Nacogdoches, there were no other survey calls. And I just want to go back in time and thump that surveyor between the eyes and ask him what he was doing. But this was Indian territory. This was a Cherokee land grant from Sam Houston that President Lamar, after Houston was voted out, reneged on. And so old maps of Nacogdoches just show a void north of Nacogdoches to the Red River. So it was just very unaccounted for. And even though Nacogdoches was a busy, the oldest town in Texas and busy for 300 years, there really are no maps showing any solid road evidence out of there. I've been able to track it down in other ways. Any questions about the map or the location of the trace? I'll move on. Yes, ma'am.
Where's Shelby County located?
Shelby is down farther south and to the east. It's right along the Sabine River. Angelina County is south of Nacogdoches, and then Shelby County is south and east of that. Yes, sir.
I understand that the Sabine doesn't run into the Mississippi.
No, it exits into the Gulf. Yes, Port Arthur, right.
But the red does.
It becomes, yes, and the Sabine River becomes the boundary below Logansport, so about halfway down that eastern boundary.
But the red runs into the Mississippi.
Not directly, does it? Does it run into the Mississippi? Yes, it does, yeah. Way farther down. Yeah. So as I mentioned, these, Trammel's Trace and roads used by these later immigrants to Texas were early animal trails and Indians following animals. The crossing at Pecan Point at the Red River was a low water crossing where buffalo crossed 3 times a year. So a lot of people are going to gather there for that pinch point with game. And by 1815, 1818, there were traders and Tennesseans, for the most part, making some pretty ambitious settlements along this area well upriver from Bolton. These trails, long distance trade, a lot of that's verified. This is back to your Memphis to St. Francis River. This is a map of that showing, and I've enlarged some of the schematics here. The military road was built here, but these road corridors were always followed roads that had been there before. These Indian trails were there because it was the easiest path through the terrain. So it made sense that the corridors would stand and hold together as a place where roads would be found. My saying is that old roads follow older roads until the bulldozers show up. That's basically, you're going to curve around the contours of a hill rather than going up over it. You're going to find the shortest distance to get across that creek bottom, that floodplain, as you can. So it's not unusual to see these corridors of roads like this. You know, some people, you know, you can have some professional tell you what your color is. You might be a blue person or a yellow person or a green person. I'm the color of old paper. That's what I've determined. That all that yellowing paper that you guys keep up with in the archives, that's me. Somewhat of the smell as well. I don't know. Really hard to get off of you. So I love those maps. So when I learned that Bowie and Crockett and Sam Houston walked across our pasture, I got really interested in learning more about that, and that's what really led to the story. There are 14 or 15 National Historic Trails, and only 2 of them are named for people. And when you think about this, the trails that you know, they're not named for people. They're named for where they go. The Natchez Trace went to Natchez, right? The fact that this was named for Nicholas Trammel says a lot. And, you know, he was attributed with opening up part of the trace when the Red River settlers heard about Austin's colony opening up in 1821. He was credited directly with opening up that road. But he was a smuggler as well and would have used it to move horses down through East Texas, which was not patrolled by any authorities. Spain certainly didn't have the presence to cover that. So it was his by use and by attribution to him. He was born along the Tennessee-Kentucky border, north of where Nashville is now. In fact, his father signed the Cumberland Compact, which was the first government authority established in that area. There were always traders and horsemen. He always had racehorses, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that, his history. He made and lost a lot of money in Arkansas racing horses. How'd you like to tell people that you grew up in Rogues Harbor? That would be like a little bit of stereotyping, wouldn't it? But that's what they call that area. This is a good time too. That painting and this one are by David Wright. He's a Cumberland area artist who was incredible. Historic detail, covers this period. He was very kind to let me use his images in there. But this is a station camp, and these early settlers in Tennessee, of which Trammel's father was one, came on these long hunts and built station camps, lean-tos that became station forts that became these early settlements in Tennessee and Kentucky. So his era, he was born in 1780, Louisiana Purchase 1803. He was maturing and hitting his prime at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. So like the family did in other cases, they didn't go deep into the new territory, but they definitely made a presence. So he grew up right about there, and right about there is where he ended up in 1807 to start his 10-year process of laying claim to a square mile of land near Batesville. He was there with the very civilized Cherokee and a lot of the early Tennesseans. He made his way down to Pecan Point about 1818, 19 in that period, and was there with other Tennesseans for a while. The first mention of him in the public record was a complaint by some very civilized Cherokee chiefs that he and his half-brother, Moat Askins, you sometimes see it as Askey, were inciting the Cherokee they were not only stealing horses from the Cherokee, they were inciting the Cherokee to burn the houses and rob the honest and industrious part of the white inhabitants near us. I'm sure that was to get the attention of the governor to whom this letter was written, the governor of the Missouri Territory. So that was in 1813. That was the earliest indication of what Trammel's family business was. And he did smuggle horses, but Trammel's not the kind of guy who's going to do this. This is one method of capturing horses, was to creasing, which is nicking their spinal cord with a ball to bring them down. It's not real accurate, so you lost horses too. But Philip Nolan, in 1835, was along the Red River prairies in 3 different trips. On one of them, he brought 1,100 Mustangs from the Red River prairies down to Natchez to sell. So a lot of business in just capturing these horses, and that was what Trammel was involved in. As Brian mentioned, I've got a degree in social work, so I've hang out with crazy people. I've been paid to work with people who see things and have serious mental health issues sometimes. So you learn to pick up on personalities. My other career has been in human resources, so I thought I had a pretty good idea of who Nick Trammel was. He was not a guns blazing outlaw. He was not confrontational. He would sue you for 10 years through 5 courts, but he was not confrontational. And in 1846, when U.S. soldiers were coming through Washington, where he had the tavern at that time, they needed somebody to lead them into Texas. And so everybody said, well, Nick, he knows Texas well. So he was recommended. And this soldier wrote a description, first-hand description of Nicholas Trammel. And it so perfectly fits not the 1846 time frame, but his prime 1813, 1820s. It fits that period, and it fits the physical description so well in this David Wright painting. Trammel's about 50 years of age. He was actually 66 at the time. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, a spare but sinewy frame, having a long, thin face and small gray eyes. I did a presentation at the Bullock Museum, and 2 Trammel family members were there, and they said that described about half of their family. And as you would expect a tavern keeper to be, he was intelligent and shrewd and very agreeable in conversation. But one of the soldiers was sure that they bought milk from the same family 3 mornings in a row. So I'm assuming Trammel was getting paid by the day and just circling around, because it took a while for him to make his way down to Texas, and he, in fact, turned back before he got there. But they also describe this about him. This is perfectly describes his approach as a businessman, or as I call it, a frontier opportunist. He would perform with fidelity and honor whatever he undertook, but it was prudent to watch him after he completed his engagement. So those relatives that you invite over for Thanksgiving dinner and then you count the silver after they leave, that's kind of Nicholas Trammel. What'd you punch her for? You got relatives? Okay, I got it. I knew it usually connects with somebody. So to my mom's great displeasure, I'm pretty sure Nicholas Trammel was a Methodist, or at least his family was a Methodist. I grew up Methodist. And a gambler, which is not as in opposition as you might think, but his family was very much involved in the early Methodist history around Batesville and into Pecan Point, where Methodists came to that Batesville area by 1815. His second marriage was by an elder of the Methodist Church, and his half-brother Moat's son, who Nick raised, was described at his death as a Methodist and a Mason and a Democrat from Gonzales County in Texas, where they later ended up. Where they settled up near Batesville was along the White River and Oil Trough Bottom, just west of the swamp. Burnside, Robbins, other well-known Tennesseans you can track all the way down from Tennessee to the White River area to Pecan Point down into Texas. Huge connections. Sulfur Fork Factory during that trading period, I don't find that Trammel was directly involved with that, but he would have either been a part of it peripherally or used it as an outlet. Just as an example of how quickly this kind of trade exploded and in some ways decimated the business that they were involved in, hunting and trapping. In 2 years, just from Sulphur Fork, 30,000 deer skins went down the river. That's just an incredible amount of game. Similar things were happening in East Texas. As Dr. Bolton pointed out, roads were the earliest priority, not only of the new territory, but anytime county governments were set up, the first county commissioners court minutes that I look at in every county, they very quickly, page 2 or 3, they start appointing road overseers. So this group of men who live in that area are appointed to care for a road from here to there, and these are the people that are responsible for maintaining that. There's Little Rock, and here's Washington and remains of that old Southwest Trail. road cuts like this, that's clearly not a cut for a vehicle. I think this may be part of the Camden, Washington Camden Road that Peggy Lloyd had researched. That width was not created by any powered vehicle. That was people and horses and wagons. There's a group of us, I've been involved for, 10 or 12 years in trying to find remains of of Trammel's trace, and we call ourselves Rut Nuts. We've even got a shirt. So these improved roads, improved was very much a subjective description. One gentleman tried to describe it: you bark your knees successfully against half a dozen stumps before you reach your destination, after which you offer up sincere thanks to the giver of good that you do not break your neck or fall in the mud. So the county specified, based on the diameter of the tree, how tall the stump could be, because you couldn't remove stumps very easily. So they would just be there, and they were cut to go below wagon axles, and the diameter determined, how tall the stump would be. And they also legislated how far out from the center line stumps could be cleared. It was amazing. So the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 started to really codify this boundary between the United States and Spain, falling along the Red River. This boundary on the east side was in dispute off and on throughout the years. The neutral ground, an area between the American troops and Spanish troops, was defined, and where neither one of those troops would go, which just meant that criminals and outlaws took over there, and there was nobody to pursue them. A lot of the people I speak to in Texas were, descendants of that crowd. Pecan Point and Jonesboro up the Red River, as I mentioned, were two key early settlements along the Red River. And if you consider, if you're coming from Tennessee and Arkansas, you're going to go down into Austin's colony, north of Houston, to go that far west up to Pecan Point seems counterintuitive. It's visually far out of the way, but that was the only people there, and they were fellow Tennesseans. So Houston and Crockett both made their way up through those settlements before coming farther south into Texas history. So at that point, changes really happened very quickly, both in the territory and things going on in the territory that would affect the later Texas becoming republic in 1836. Hempstead County at one time covered all the way up to Pecan Point. And because that boundary was so ill-defined, even after the Adams-Onis Treaty, Miller County, Arkansas was on the Texas side of the Red River. And this old Miller County is a very misunderstood part of Texas history as well. Filibusters, people who wanted to try to overthrow the Spanish government in Texas, were active in making attempt after attempt in Nacogdoches to take over from the Spaniards. Moses Austin was granted colonization rights, and his son Stephen F. Austin, of course, opened up the colonies in 1821. Two Pecan Pointers made their way down flooded roads. Trammel's Trace was even named at that point that early. And when they got to Nacogdoches, they discovered that the colonies had been opened up, and they made their way back up 180 to 200 miles of that trace back up to the Red River. And that's when Nicholas Trammel started widening that route to make room for wagons and stock. In 1821, Spanish Texas became Mexican Texas, and Trammel at that point sold that baseful land and fully completed his move down to Pecan Point in preparation for coming to Texas a couple of years later. This 1821 immigration to Texas was the beginning of a significant period in Texas history, in U.S. history really, because of that migration into Mexico, and to become a Mexican citizen and a good Catholic, to give the oath to the king and begin to be a part of another country's history. This is a great quote, very tactful, scholarly man. Every new country when first opened is settled by a strange mixture of heterogeneous elements, the enterprising and the virtuous, and then I love this, by the vicious of different grades who desire to escape from the trammels of the terrors of law. Your ancestors. Right. The Arkansas Gazette really had it in for Texas, and described all the people coming to Texas as a preponderance of murderers, horse thieves, counterfeiters, and fugitives from justice, which was an overly described method for explaining who was there. Certainly true, not in every case, but a lot of people were escaping debt or crime and looking for opportunity. This is a William DeWeese who made his way from Pecan Point down to Nacogdoches, arriving at the colony in New Year's Day. They were several months coming down the road, and they carried their luggage on pack horses, the roads being perfectly impassable for a vehicle of any description. So that dotted line section of Trammel's Trace down from Pecan Point was pretty miserable, and that's when Trammel was credited with widening it. The road from Arkansas Post to Little Rock, I found this mentioned in the summer of 1820. Not only were the roads bad, Dr. Bolton, you had critters. It was infested with green-headed horseflies. If you've ever been bitten by a horsefly, you know that's not much fun. And these were particularly they would say that people would ride down this section of road at full gallop to avoid the flies, but horses still sometimes died. They were stung so badly. Welcome to Arkansas, right? And this story from a guy who was in Hempstead County on his way to Texas. They were sitting around, and he very coolly said that he might stay in Hempstead County if only he could find someone to pull the ticks off of him. That's really all he needed to stop his journey. And the humor was rewarded with what they said was a stiff drink of grog. So this guy's family, if he'd found a tick picker in Arkansas, he would not have been a Texan. There's an early map of Fulton, and James Bryan, one of the names in the bottom of this ad, was a relative of Stephen F. Austin, and Austin had served as a judge briefly in Arkansas, set up some land, and with the idea that they would be merchants to this wave of immigrants coming to Texas, but were involved in selling these town lots in Fulton as well. But that article described Trammel's Trace as the most direct road leading from Missouri Territory and many of the eastern states to the extensive and fertile province of Texas, crossing the river. There's the map I was saying about. This is an 1863 Civil War map of Fulton. There were some embattlements built there. You can see this is on a huge bluff where this turns 90 degrees. Very vertical bluff. It's held up pretty well. There's the ferry boat that was there at the time, the little oar sticking out. And this speckled part is that beach on the inside of a curve of a river, and one account described it as just a crust of about 6 to 8 inches, and if horses broke through that, they would sink up to their haunches in the mud and muck below that. So Red River, was pretty friendly for low water crossings, and there were ferries up and down this crossing point, particularly in the late 20s and 30s. I was sitting in Reagan National Airport not too long ago, waiting to fly home to Houston while Houston was having a tropical storm. So I'm sitting for hours. And at the end of this terminal, the gates are in a circle. There was a bar and a restaurant, thank God, for all of us people waiting to get home. When they would issue ferry licenses in Hempstead County in the 1830s, they wouldn't just issue a ferry license, they would issue a tavern license. At the same time, I realized nothing's changed. I'm still stuck here waiting to get somewhere, and oh, by the way, here's a drink. So great businesses, just business models last forever. that road that was getting all the $20,000 of improvements that Dr. Bolton talked about from Washington down to Fulton, the last section of it is down a fairly steep grade that's red slick clay, and so they put a corduroy road there. Corduroy roads are logs sawed in half and placed next to each other so that you would ride down like this, but the road wouldn't wash out as quickly. The map maker, I thought, was extremely tactful. People were apparently a lot more polite back then, and he described on the Texas side of the Red River as simply impracticable. And it was impracticable because in that floodplain where those cotton farms are now, right along I-30 at Fulton, was 7 miles of switch cane 30 feet high. The trail cut through the middle of it and the cane arched over it, so you were in the dark for 7 miles of entering into that new country, whatever it may have been at the time. Trammel was credited by name as widening the trail from Pecan Point with chopping axes and hatchets to allow families to move down that, and he himself moved down anticipating his own attempt to get into Austin's colony. In about 1822 or 23, there's nothing to establish that firmly. He did show up in the Nacogdoches archives for 24 to 26 quite regularly over court cases and horse races. He witnessed a murder. He lost a horse race for the prize of a pig, and the court case and his attempt to recover that pig is well documented. And he chose sides in some local disputes there. In 1824, he had court actions going in Lawrence County, Arkansas, in Livingston County, Kentucky, and in Nacogdoches in Mexico, in all three jurisdictions at the same time. Mostly because he would, if he lost a case, he would appeal it to the highest court. The Sevier family in Arkansas represented him in court cases that he had here in Arkansas. He's in the Supreme Court records over a $200 or $300 debt that took 7 years to resolve. He was just that kind of guy. He's also one of the very few people, I haven't found but one other person named by Stephen F. Austin as they will absolutely not enter the colony. So in Texas, the members of that original 300 settlers are called the Old 300. The families are very proud of that. So in speaking to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, I told them I thought I might start a genealogical affinity group similar to theirs, except it would be people refused entry by Austin into Texas, and see what kind of membership we might get. But he and a man named William English were named as criminals and bad men, meaning they weren't cotton farmers or otherwise able to contribute to the good of the colony. So instead of coming down into Austin's land grant in 1824, he set up right here on the Trinity River at a crossing of the El Camino Real. This would be the intersection of two major routes of transportation. And when you hear the word transportation in the 1820s in Texas, you should translate that to smuggling. This was Mexican Texas, and they did not allow people to trade across the river very easily, and so smugglers filled the gap with horses and trade goods. And so Trammel was set up there by Hayden Edwards, an impresario who had a very troubled grant like Austin's, and he set Trammel up on a crossing of the river at this key road. And where all the other land grants were on one side of the river or the other, Trammel's extended for a mile on both sides of the river along this road. So who knows what happened there? There's no records any kept of that, but there was such a dispute over the land and the way Hayden Edwards assigned the land, basically stole it from a Mexican settler. Trammel and his family were chased out of Texas in 1826 as a precursor to the Fredonian Rebellion, one of those attempts to overthrow the Mexican government that failed. And they ran all the way back up to Batesville for a short time, tried to recover that land, and then came back down to Lost Prairie, where they settled and built plantations and taverns along there. And he stayed from 1826 until 1850, 52, when his entire family relocated to LaGrange and Gonzales in Texas for reasons that I don't know. They wasted no time in getting cited and arrested for having gambling operations in downtown LaGrange. The Colonization Act in 1825 was described like Texas, the California Gold Rush was the land rush in Texas. Mexico changed their policies yet again to encourage more Anglo-colonization, and a week after that, Trammel, in a dispute of a court case, had his gun and horse sold at auction. So it was not a great time in Texas. We didn't treat Nicholas Trammel very well, and they retreated back to Arkansas. So he was, you know, Trammel's trace, I think of as a one-way route. People were coming south and into Texas and using that route, and you know, Trammel's making his way back up it, going north back to Arkansas would have been an unusual approach. Trammel, as I said, you know, became a part of Texas history in this Fredonian Rebellion when he was ordered to vacate and then run out of Texas. They went back to Batesville. Here's Old Washington. Here's Lost Prairie, where they were for a few years. His son, one of his sons, ended up having a very large plantation there, one on this side of the Red River and one on the other. And then this intersection is where, excuse me, that's Camden. This intersection right in this area would be where Trammel's gambling house was. There's the cane that they went through and where that plantation at Lost Prairie was found. There were also a lot of things going on in on the north side of the Red River that were the stirrings of the revolution in Texas. Okay. Ben Milam, Colin McKinney were both signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. Ben Milam on the left was killed in the Siege of Bear just before the Battle of Alamo. Martin Parmer in Nacogdoches shot Trammel's half-brother, and don't really know why, but they ended up living in land next to each other east of Washington. But Mark Parmer, his nickname was supposedly the Ringtail Panther. He was apparently quite a dangerous man, but we had no problem with it becoming part of the Declaration of Independence. Ben Milam was one of the early ferry licenses along the Red River. He was also a part of Wavell's colony, which never really materialized, which was up along south of the Red River. And so Milam was very much involved on the Arkansas side of things, helping to operate these crossings where who knows what the ferries look like. But at various times, you know, logs, this looks like channeled rafts, were used to cross people and equipment. So Trammel moved to Hempstead County in 1833. At this crossroad, that was a major stand. Stands were like stopping points along roads. There were formal stands along Natchez Trace. I don't know that there were too many along the Southwest Trail, but the stand was, if you were in Texas, a stand would be like Buc-ee's or, you know, a convenience store. But it was a voting location. It was a cattle mound, very well-known location for him. In 1836, he issued this racing challenge for a horse race, a 2-mile horse race to a man for $1,000 to $2,000. And not only did he issue the challenge, he was doing it because the man that Trammel was challenging had been issuing a challenge for a man that Trammel says, you knew he couldn't come. You quit picking on him. Take me on. I'll race you for $1,000 to $2,000. And, oh, by the way, let me know whether you're going to come or not. So it seemed a little snide to me, and it kind of fit that challenging part of Trammel's personality. The game that they ran most of the time was a card game called Pharaoh, and certainly nothing like this scene, but the card game was the same. And then, as I mentioned, they were back to Texas around 1852. I have no idea. He died there at age 76, which is quite old at that time, and no burial site is known at this point. So the future of Trammel's Trace really is kind of what the ongoing story has been about. I've taken what I've learned from the Dawson's research and the General Land Office maps and done a very detailed map on my website, trammelstrace.com. You can call up a Google Maps overlay of Trammel's Trace on the Texas side. There's really no markers. You can't drive near it here in Arkansas. But as you drive through East Texas, you can see where the trace was when they did the survey, or where I think it crossed or have found it. And for a curious guy, starting a few years ago, last year, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas erected this 4-foot black granite monument. There's print on the back. My name's in a black granite marker, Dr. Bolton, and I didn't even die. It's so cool.
That's the best way.
That's the best way. I was very humbled, though. A man came up and said, yeah, I saw your marker. It's right near a farmer's market. My wife went over to the farmer's market, and my dog and I went over to the marker. I just want to let you know, my dog loves your marker. So I just polish it when I go by. I polished extra down at the bottom. So this has all materialized just purely because I've just been curious and have had no, academic drive or golden investor. So please buy a book. Think about buying a book or two or several for Christmas. The book on Trammel's Trace is $25, and the one on Hendricks Lake, which is a treasure legend connected to the trace, is $20. But you'll find a lot of Arkansas history inside this book about how people came to Texas and what happened in those early years, particularly before the Republic. So I'm going to stick around the rest of the day, and looking forward to talking to you some more about this. But thank you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, well, welcome back. And as you can tell, we've got lots of sandwiches left over. So at the end of the day, we would be very happy if you would take some home with you, because otherwise we're going to have to carry them with us and find places in our refrigerators. So we don't want to do that. So our speaker right now is Callie Williams. She is a native of Arkansas, graduated from the University of Arkansas in 2008 with a bachelor's degree in science in architectural studies. In 2010, she earned a master's in architectural history from the University of Virginia. In 2011, she joined the Department of Arkansas Heritage's Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, and where she serves as education and outreach coordinator. She works to promote the study of and preservation of Arkansas's historic places through educational programs for all ages and scholarly research. So welcome, Callie Williams.
Thank you. Thank y'all very much. As Brian said, my name is Callie Williams, and I work with the Department of Arkansas Heritage. My basic role is to do outreach for adults and to do scholarly research, and this one fit right in. We've been celebrating this year the 200th anniversary of the creation of Arkansas Territory, or the Territory of Arkansas. In March of 1819, the United States Congress approved an act that established the Territory of Arkansas, which would officially be created on July 4th of 1819. And prior to the arrival of waves of settlers of European descent from the 17th through the 19th century, the Arkansas Territory was populated, as you know, by various tribes and communities of Native Americans for thousands of years. The native inhabitants of the area had a rich tradition of community building and settlement that were slowly and sometimes violently displaced by the arriving waves of immigrants who were coming to the area. These new settlers introduced their own traditions of building, settlement, farming, and commerce as they spread across the landscape that would eventually become the state of Arkansas. They also brought with them their traditional cultural beliefs and slaves as early as the 17th century. These new arrivals also brought with them building traditions and transformed the landscape they encountered and introduced new trade and settlement routes. They also developed new communities that soon turned into important regional trading centers. These first settlements were often located, as we've heard before, along rivers such as the Arkansas, the Washita, the White, and the Little Red. And towns such as Arkansas Post, Batesville, Searcy, Cadron, Camden, Helena, and Little Rock were some of the earliest scattered communities. And other than that, there were lots of independent family farmsteads. So there were lots of people in this area, just not a lot of large settlements until later. Just a quick note, since we are celebrating the bicentennial of the Arkansas Territory, the Department of Arkansas Heritage does have a poster if you would like to order it through our department. I've got cards with me as well, but you can call our front desk at the Department of Arkansas Heritage and get this really nice poster with a map of that Arkansas Territory. The earliest settlement by white Europeans in what would become the state of Arkansas occurred in 1686 near Arkansas Post along the Arkansas River, not far from its confluence with the Mississippi River. This outpost would serve as the local military, government, and trade center for the next 140 years. It is also important to note that by at least 1721, slaves and indentured servants are also documented at the post. Although inhabited only sporadically through the early 1700s, the site known as Arkansas Post eventually became a regional hub for trade and a military garrison for the French, who had claimed much of the land along the Mississippi River. After the end of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, in the 1760s, the surrounding area was ceded to Spain, who occupied the fort site while many French settlers remained in the area. In 1800, the area was returned to France, but no new military forces were sent to the area. In 1804, after the Louisiana Purchase, the remaining Spanish troops at Arkansas Post and French troops left. They were transferred the site to the United States, who sent forces to the post and soon opened their official trading center. In 1819, when Arkansas became a territory, Arkansas Post served as the first territorial capital. The first territorial governor, Sir James Miller, arrived at Arkansas Post after traveling from his home in New Hampshire on the day after Christmas in 1819. He arrived on a vessel flying flags that read Arkansas, spelled with a W, and quote, "I will try, sir," end quote. This "I will try" was his personal motto that he had gained after his military career during the War of 1812. There's a famous note of him being asked to capture this garrison, and he writes back saying, "I will try, sir," and then he goes on to capture the garrison, so it kind of becomes his personal motto. Many of our military leaders had those same kind of personal mottos, but he had a flag, and he brought with him armaments that he had bought on the way to Arkansas. So he's basically bringing guns and ammunition and a boat with him so that he could arrive in style as the Arkansas's first governor. Actually, he arrived 10 months late. He was appointed governor, but decided that he needed to get some things on the way, and he was also waiting for cooler weather. So during that 10 months, local Robert Crittenden, who was the secretary of the territory, was the one who ran the state and actually filled most of the appointments. There was also a kind of a battle afterwards of whether those appointments were legal or not, which James Miller eventually declared after he got here that they were fine, and the people who were appointed could stay in their positions. Governor Miller would not stay in Arkansas full time. He wanted to escape the hot summers at his home in New Hampshire, and so he left Crittenden to do much of the actual governing of the territory of Arkansas in his absence. As one of the most populous communities in the new territory, Arkansas Post would have been surrounded with log and frame structures, as well as impressive fortifications from various periods of French, Spanish, and United States colonization. Arkansas Post was soon one of the first large-scale trading ports in the territory, and by 1820, steamboats were regularly stopping at the port. While the arrival of new settlers to the west led more people to be west of Arkansas Post, the territorial capital was quickly moved to the new city of Little Rock in 1821. All of the original territorial period buildings associated with the various forts and communities have long since vanished from the landscape, most importantly because the Arkansas River has kind of eaten away at the site over time. There is a visitor center there that's there today, and it's run by the National Park Service. The site of Arkansas Post was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, and it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1970, I believe. Today, the National Park Service, as I said, operates the Arkansas Post National Memorial Site, Visitor Center, and a museum. This is part of that visitor center, which interprets the over 300 years of European settlement at the site. Unfortunately, there's not really, you can go to that place, but there's not any original buildings left. There are archaeological remains, but not anything that you can see when you approach the site. One also interesting project, since I mentioned James Miller, he was our first official territorial governor, our department has been working and has finished a project to recognize and locate all of the grave sites of our Arkansas governors, stretching back through territorial years to the present. So that's on our website, arkansaspreservation.com. There's actually a map to where all of those governors are buried. Most of them are in Arkansas, several of them are not. James Miller is not, he's in Massachusetts because he went back home after he left Arkansas. This was not his home. He never wanted to really put down roots in Arkansas. Further north along the Mississippi River is the city of Helena, which was another important river port city. The city was created in 1820 by Sylvanus Phillips and William Russell, and by the 1850s would become a commercial hub for the plantations of the Mississippi River Delta. One striking residence in Helena, known as Estevan Hall, is a rare surviving example of the French colonial architectural tradition in the territory of Arkansas. The house has many of the characteristics associated with French colonial buildings, often seen in areas throughout the Mississippi River Valley associated with early French exploration and settlement. This house looks a lot like those houses that you might see if you go further up the river toward places like St. Louis, St. Genevieve, some of those places that still had a large French presence for longer. Constructed in circa 1826, Estevan Hall features the low-pitched roof, large open porches, a raised main floor on a tall brick foundation, exterior stucco walls, and narrow window and door openings typical of French colonial architectural traditions. The house was well planned to take advantage of its sloping site, and its central hall plan and large porches allows the house to take full advantage of cross breezes in the humid Delta summer. The house was also built over a natural spring, which provided the inhabitants with a convenient and abundant water supply and created a cool storage area in the basement. Estevan Hall was built by brothers Fleetwood and Melander Hanks and would serve as a home for generations of descendants. The house has maintained its historic exterior appearance on the front, despite its constant use as a residence for nearly 2 centuries. It is also noted in local histories that Helen Keller's maternal grandparents, Charles Adam and Lucy Ellen Everett, were married in the house in September of 1845. In 1919, the name was given to the house, Estevan Hall, by Miss Johnny Porter Stevens, who was a descendant of Fleetwood Hanks, who had recently moved back into the house with her husband, Harry Stevens. The name was said to be of a Spanish flavor in honor of her new husband, Harry. So it's a Spanish name for a French colonial house. So it's a little weird. This important early house was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1974 and is currently undergoing a large restoration campaign. It's been going on for several years and hopefully will be open to the public sometime in the future. Any other question? Helena, yep. It's not far from downtown Helena. Actually, if you're driving into town, you'll usually see it. If there's a park across the street as well, that's part of their Civil War trail in Helena. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, waves of new immigrants to Arkansas started to settle along the Southwest Trail, which we had talked about earlier in some of the military roads. The main overland network of trails and roads that bisected the state from northeast to southwest. It is estimated that about 4/5 of new immigrants to the state, or to the territory, came after 1817 along the Southwest Trail. The development and construction of early roadways through the territory helped to facilitate the population growth and followed the creation of the state of Arkansas in 1836. Some of the earliest towns on the Southwest Trail were Jackson in Randolph County, Little Rock, and Washington and Hempstead County, which we've all talked about before. As we said earlier too, parts of that Southwest Trail and other remnants of it also became known as military roads, especially after those congressional appropriations in the 1830s. The Southwest Trail and development of these military roads also helped to facilitate the creation of new cities, where settlers banded together, including Hot Springs, Rockport, Arkadelphia, and Benton. Modern roadways today, as we said before, often follow these early pioneer routes. However, portions do still exist that evoke the original military road look. And I think we did see one picture earlier, but here's a few more. There are trails, including one called the Military Trail at Village Creek State Park near Wynn. These trails follow a segment of the Memphis to Little Rock Military Road completed in 1829 that also served as a major route for the later Trail of Tears in the decades following its completion. This and several other sections of the Southwest Trail and Military Road have been identified and listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and there are several sections across the state that have been identified. And these are just a few examples, all from Village Creek State Park near Wynn. Also during the territorial period in Arkansas, the most common building types that would have been seen were log or rough-hewn timber constructions. These were quick and easy to build using local resources. You didn't have to go far to cut down a tree and move it to your site and shape it and then build it into a home. Common log cabin forms in Arkansas were the single-room log cabin, often referred to as the single pen, P-E-N, the double-room cabin or the double pen, so two of those pens together, and the dog trot cabin, which consisted of 2 rooms or pens separated by an open breezeway. There were also a multitude of construction techniques for these cabins, including various ways of dressing or shaping the log, from circular to square to half circles. And there were also various notching techniques, so how the logs fit together at the corners. These would be dovetails, these would be square, be round, half round. There's a ton of different ways, and most of those ways came from the traditions that people brought with them. So a German tradition might be different than a Scandinavian tradition, might be different than an English building tradition. So it just kind of depended on what you were familiar with, where you came from when you came to Arkansas, what construction techniques you might use to build these. As more people settled in the area, local sawmills often could provide cut timber for frame dwellings, and a lot of times these were considered more permanent buildings if it was made out of frame construction, so wood planks, versus a log construction, which would be considered the fastest, quickest thing we could put up. That was the temporary, that was the first thing, and then you might replace it with a frame building later. As communities developed and more craftsmen moved into the territory, industries such as brickmaking and sawmills allowed for more elaborate buildings, especially in larger population centers. The next building we're talking about is one of those early log cabins. I put this picture in here. This is from Ozark Vernacular Houses by Gene Sizemore, which is kind of one of the best looks at vernacular houses in the Ozarks. But this is a very rare picture from the 1930s. Of what an interior of one of these houses would probably look like, these log frame houses. They would have covered the walls with something in a lot of places. You would have had an open fireplace, you would have had a mantle. This was actually one that they found in the 1930s and took a picture of, one that hadn't been electrified. We know of very few examples that survive of these interiors. I know of one, and that house was actually from the 1880s, 1890s, so it's not even territorial in time period. But for log cabins, you also have to think they're building these in the 1800s, 1820s, 30s, 40s. They're still building like this in 1900, 1910s. You know, you still have places that are making frame buildings in these same styles 100 years later in Arkansas. So even if you see a log cabin, it could be from 1900. That's because they're still using these techniques in Arkansas, especially rural places in Arkansas. One that is from the territorial period is the Rice Upshaw House, known locally as Reuben Rice's. It's an excellent example of restored early Arkansas frontier log structure. The Rice Upshaw House was built in circa 1828 as a store and loom house by Reuben Rice. The structure served as the heart of a small rural trading community along the 11-Point River near the community of Dalton in Randolph County. Reuben Rice arrived in 1812 after traveling with a wagon train of farmers and their slaves. After about a mile from Reuben Rice, William Looney also settled on the opposite shore of the river at roughly the same time. These new settlers established small farmsteads, and the Rice Upshaw House served as an early commercial center where the Rice family sold fabric that they had produced from their local crop of flax. The original log structure included only a single open room, known as a pen, and had a fireplace with a large chimney at one end. The property also included an early log granary and for the storage of corn and wheat, and Rice would eventually become a prosperous local civic leader. His descendants expanded the log structure and made the new family home, which would serve the next 5 generations of the Rice and Upshaw families. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 2004, and in that same year, the property was donated to the farm to the Black River Technical College in Pocahontas to use it as an educational site. So this was when it was donated, roughly here on the left, so you can see that it had been covered, it was kind of hidden. And this is a family picture of the same site from early 1900s. And then this is the site today after its restoration back to that single pen. The nearby Looney French House, so this is Dalton, the Rice Upshaw House on one side and the Looney French house on the other, also known as the Looney Tavern, was also recently restored under the direction of Black River Technical College with funds from the Arkansas Natural and Cultural Resources Council. This structure was built as a large 1.5-story log dog trot structure in circa 1833 to serve as a tavern and inn, as well as a site for the Looney Distillery, which is thought at the time to produce 1,500 gallons of apple brandy a year. Both of these sites are important because they are rare. They're surviving structures that have the original structures intact. They're also important examples of log construction, the earliest common type of construction in territorial Arkansas. Both of these sites are open to the public on specific weekends of the year. You have to check the REACH website. They release a schedule of when they're going to have them open. And they're run under the Black River Technical College kind of umbrella. So this is an example of a 1.5-story dog trot. The next one we're going to talk about is probably the most famous log structure in Arkansas, which is the Jacob Wolf House, which was constructed in circa 1829 as the first permanent courthouse for Izard County of Arkansas Territory. It survives today as the oldest civic building in the state, and the Wolf House was constructed under the direction of John Wolf, pictured here, after he secured funding from the General Assembly, of which he was a member, to have a courthouse built near his homestead and land he graciously donated to the county for that purpose. So basically he got to build himself a house with money from the state and use it as a courthouse. The courthouse building is an imposing 2-story log structure with a central breezeway at the first floor. This 2-room and central open hall form commonly is referred to as the dog trot. The first floor was occupied by the county clerk's office, and the large room on the second floor was the courthouse, or courtroom. In 1835, the county seat was relocated to a new courthouse and the property returned to his ownership. He then made the large courthouse structure his family home. The space was sorely needed as he had 16 children and 5 stepchildren. This early territorial structure was recognized as an important historical site by the 1930s when local organizations and residents undertook various preservation campaigns. In 1999, a grant from the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program funded the restoration of the building to its original territorial appearance. And the Department of Arkansas Heritage took over ownership of the property. That happened in 2017, and they now operate at the Jacob Wolf House site near Norfolk, which is open to the public most days. Residents along the various trails in Arkansas often became landmarks, such as the Wolf House, and more settlers streamed into the territory during the 1820s. One such house was the residence built by Jacob Barkman, considered the father of Clark County and the city of Arkadelphia. Barkman started construction on what would certainly have been an imposing 2-story brick house and detached kitchen in 1815, most likely designed and built in the federal style that was popular during the time period. Described by journalists as, quote, probably the best in the territory, end quote, the house was located along the banks of the Caddo River, overlooking the nearby Southwest Trail, and was likely the first brick structure in what is today Clark County and the surrounding region. The house soon became a local landmark and served as the first county courthouse of Clark County in 1818, the first post office in the area, and a stagecoach stop. Also by 1831, the open area in front of the home was used as a racetrack, with a nearby Indian mound serving as seating area for the public. Unfortunately, the house was soon destroyed after Jacob Barkman's death in 1852, and part of Barkman's original large property holding was sold to Arkadelphia Methodist College, now Henderson State University, which built its campus on his land. The Jacob Barkman House was located not far from where Interstate 30 and US 67 crossed the Caddo River, so that's where basically that little red star is. During the 1850s to the early 1860s, his son James Barkman, also built a large and impressive land on original Barkman land. After serving the Barkman family and their descendants and others as a family home for more than a century, the house was sold to Henderson State Teachers College in 1968. This house, a remnant of the Barkman family, still stands as a university-owned property and was listed in the National Register in 1974. Another high-style territorial house that unfortunately has been lost, though we do have records of what it looked like, was the 20th century home, or was the home of Archibald Yell, Arkansas' first congressman, second governor, and Mexican war hero. He was a powerful political figure in early Arkansas after moving to Washington County in present-day northwest Arkansas in early 1835. He had served in Little Rock as the receiver of public moneys and adjutant general of the territorial militia from 1831 to 1832, until being incapacitated by malaria, which caused him to return to Tennessee to recover. During 1835, after moving back to Arkansas, into northwest Arkansas, where he was basically a judge, he commissioned a new house in Fayetteville in a Greek revival style, and he called it Waxhaws, Waxhaws. The house was originally painted white, had 4 rooms, and incorporated Masonic symbols in the chimneys. The house would have stood in stark contrast to the rough log cabins and simple board-clad dwellings that would have been the majority in the surrounding area. The house was built as a statement of style and power in this newly settled landscape in far north Arkansas Territory. Unfortunately, as I said, the house was demolished in the 1960s. However, the separate law office that was also on the property that Yell built in 1835 survived and was moved in the 1990s to the headquarters house, property owned by Washington County Historical Society, where it still stands and is open to the public as part of that museum. While some amazing historic structures still exist from territorial Arkansas, we do have to understand that the majority of structures that were built, one, were not built to last a long time. They were rough-hewn structures. A lot of them got demolished or just fell down over time. And two, a lot of them there would be 200 years old now. They just fell out of use and became no longer usable and were torn down. So this makes the surviving examples all the more precious as windows to our past. Also closely associated with the Southwest Trail is the old Hempstead County Courthouse in Washington, which is an example of a simple wood-frame federal-style public building built just as the territory was transitioning into a state in 1836. This building was commissioned by the leaders of the county as the second purpose-built courthouse in the town after they had outgrown a smaller structure nearby. The new building was located along the Southwest Trail and served as the main street through the town of Washington. This project was supervised by Tillman Patterson and completed at a cost of $1,850. Today, the building is more commonly associated with the Civil War, as the town of Washington served as the Confederate state capital from 1863 to 1865, after the capture of Little Rock by Union forces. This building served as the Capitol building, and at least 2 sessions of the Arkansas General Assembly were held in the building during the war. Afterwards, the building continued to serve as the county courthouse until 1874, when a new brick courthouse was constructed, and that building is also still at Old Washington in the state park. This building itself is open to the public as part of that state park, and all of that area is a state park that surrounds it, so it does have lots of these kind of period of buildings. One quick note too, the photographs that I'm showing on this last half of the slideshow here, the ones that are in black and white that say Library of Congress, these were all taken as part of the Historic American Building Survey, which was a program that was put in effect during the New Deal, and it was a way to get architects, artists, photographers back to work by going out and surveying and collecting information on historic properties across the country. You can search through all of those archives at the Library of Congress website. If you just type in Library of Congress and HABS, H-A-B-S, you'll find a lot of these images. And for a lot of these buildings, this is the only remnant we might have of these structures. Some from territorial days, but some from the late 1800s, early 1900s as well. A lot of these, they took photographs of several buildings that got torn down maybe the next year or just a few years later. So these are great records. And sometimes, like this one, they will actually have architectural drawings that they did in the 1930s as well. You need a quick question? I have. It's not territorial as far as I know. Yeah. In central Arkansas, we have a few other buildings that are also associated with the territorial period. This is the McHenry House, also known as the 10 Mile House or the Stagecoach House, built sometime between 1825 and 1836, so statehood. It's to the west of the original core of the city of Little Rock, and it was along the Southwest Trail, as many of these have been, and south of the Arkansas River. Archibald McHenry purchased the surrounding land after moving from Tennessee sometime around 1820 and soon built a log house. His children, John and Henry McHenry, constructed the surviving brick home next to their father's log cabin on the family farmstead. This 1.5-story brick house is a rare surviving example of a relatively elaborate federal-style farm residence from the territorial period. The front facade is designed to be symmetrical around the central entrance, which leads into the central hallway and staircase, and is capped by a paired chimney at either end of the house. The house also has large multi-pane windows and limited ornamentation around the windows and entries, and this is all typical of the federal style, so this kind of very symmetrical style. The property also includes a large later smokehouse, dairy house, well house, and a separate kitchen house. These were all constructed during the 19th century, so during the 1800s. An advertisement in the Arkansas Gazette for boarding horses at the McHenry farm in 1832 provided the later common name for the house, as the property was noted as being, quote, 10 miles south of Little Rock, end quote. The later outbuildings on the property were constructed by local stonemasons who had moved to the area to work on the old Statehouse starting in 1836. This included Robert Brownlee and Sam McMorman. And during the Civil War, the 10 Mile House was used by Union troops and served as a temporary prison for young David O'Dodd before his trial and execution in Little Rock. The house was listed in the National Register in 1970, and it served various functions throughout its long history, but today it is a private residence again. There was a while where it was open for events, and they did have an event kind of center here, but it's a private residence again today. Located downtown Little Rock, the Hinderleiter House and Tavern started its life as a log house, tavern, and inn in the new frontier town of Little Rock. The structure was built in circa 1827 by Jesse Hinderleiter to serve as his home and business. He lived in the home with his wife and 2 slaves until his death in 1834. The building itself was constructed using red oak logs and cypress flooring, and the wooden clapboard siding and porch were added in later years. The original log structure was mostly utilitarian in nature, but a hand-carved federal mantel in the formal dining room shows that even on the frontier, a bit of style was important in public spaces. As you can see, this building had kind of a tough life for a while. During the 1930s and 1940s, it served as a boarding house for a while as well, and it's kind of, or 1920s, excuse me, and it's kind of amazing that it survived some of the stuff that was going on in downtown Little Rock to take away a lot of these historic buildings and build new buildings. Again, we have some great documentation from the Historic American Building Survey. I especially love this one with the cars out front that gives you a nice view of people parking downtown. Another building at the Historic Arkansas Museum with territorial roots, though it's not the original building, is the Woodruff Print Shop. This was originally constructed between 1823 and 24 and was a 2-story brick shop that was built by William Woodruff, Arkansas Territory's first newspaper man. Woodruff moved to Arkansas in 1819 and established the Territory's first newspaper. He originally set up shop at Arkansas Post, and he printed the first weekly edition in November of 1819. A few years later, seeing that most people were moving toward Little Rock as it was the new capital, he also moved as well. And between 1824 and 27, he lived and worked at the site of the reconstructed Woodruff Print Shop. Unfortunately, the 2-story building was mistakenly destroyed in the 1930s restoration campaign of the museum. There was a story about it not being recognized as a territorial building because it was a brick 2-story building. It looks like something that would have been built in the 1860s or 1850s. So there was kind of this misunderstanding of what a territorial building should look like, i.e. log. And so it was torn down. And then when they realized their mistake later, much lamented, the museum did restore and rebuild the building back to what we figure it would have originally looked like during the 2000s. So based on the original territorial building, but not the original building. The Hinderleiter Museum and the Hinderleiter House and the Woodruff Print Shop, now part of Historic Arkansas Museum in downtown Little Rock. The Hinderleiter Tavern is the oldest surviving structure in the city, and the reconstructed Woodruff Print Shop both can be visited during museum hours at the Historic Arkansas Museum. Located only a few blocks from there is the old Statehouse, which we have mentioned before. It was actually started while Arkansas was still a territory. The governor in 1833 decided that, we've hit the population marks, we're surely going to be a state pretty soon, so we need somewhere that we can have a territorial legislation, and we need somewhere we can have an actual state legislature. So they decided to build the old Statehouse. John Pope, who was governor at the time, hired architect Gideon Shyrock to design a state capitol building in 1833. And the old State House was designed as an elaborate and large-scale Greek Revival style structure with elaborate detailing throughout. George Weigart was sent to Little Rock by Shyrock to oversee the construction of the building, where he altered the original plans to fit within the limited budget that he found when he arrived. The building is constructed of brick with exterior stucco, and a massive triangular pediment supported by tall Doric columns are along the front south facade. Interestingly, while the Arkansas River was still the main mode of transport for people in the early territorial days, this building really signals that change in Arkansas. The building basically turns its back on the river and faces the town, so it faces the commercial center rather than the trading people who would be arriving by river at this point still too. So this is a big signal for we are no longer a territory, we are now a state. And then this kind of also presages the arrival of railroads where you don't even need the rivers anymore in later decades. So it is really a fascinating building for that turn in Arkansas history. The building was the largest and most impressive new construction project in the state during the 1830s, and definitely, as I said, marked a new period of development. And the old State House was completed in the 1840s and would serve as the backdrop of some of the most important events in Arkansas history. The old State House was replaced by the new Capitol building in 1915 and has since served as a medical school, a veterans memorial, and a community building. The old State House is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places and was recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 1997. Interestingly, it wasn't really recognized for its history as the State House, though that was an important part of it. One of its major claims of fame was the research that went on there while it was a medical school. There were a large campaign to fight malaria, and one of those programs was done while it was a medical school, the old State House, and that's actually why it's recognized as a National Historic Landmark. It stands today as the oldest surviving state capitol west of the Mississippi River, and a restoration campaign in the 1940s brought the property back open again as a museum. Today, the Department of Arkansas Heritage runs the Old State House as a museum, and the nearby Historic Arkansas Museum. Both are run by the same department, and both are open to the public. The Old State House also, sadly, is missing its pretty elaborate statue that's on the top as well. You can see that in some of these photos here, this large statue at the top. No one's really sure what happened to it, but that's one of my life goals, is to find that. I would love to be the one who finds it. We think it probably ended up in a sculpture studio for a while, and we think it probably got melted down at one point, unfortunately, but maybe someday we'll find it.
So it's bronze?
It was metal, it was of some kind, we're not really sure. We think it was probably bronze, yeah. At least like plates, because it would have been too heavy to be like a full bronze sculpture. That's basically my history of territorial buildings. I did want to do two quick other things. I did bring a few brochures with me. We will actually be touring the Old State House. It's open to the public. You can tour it anytime, but we do have a sandwiching and history program we do once a month, and this is going to be one of our buildings next year that we're going to feature. So we're glad to have it back on the rotation for us. We also have our passport program, which is National Historic register properties across the state, many of which are open to the public, and we have a little passport there echoing the National Park Service's passport program. You can go to all the sites, get your stamps, send it back in, and we'll send you a commemorative coin or patch. And it's a fun program celebrating the 50th anniversary of the National Register of Historic Places, which we've been celebrating the last couple of years. I also have my cards with me. As I said, most of these buildings, if not all, are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, that's one of our missions and goals, is to help people get properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So if you know of a site or would like to do more research on a historic property, we're more than happy to help you in that endeavor. And then I think plenty of time for questions. So.
Is it the Washington Camp Road that Peggy, I know she applied, Peggy Lloyd applied for that to be on the National Register, did it too?
I think so. As I said, there's several sections that are listed in the National Register. We love finding, we have one person in our office, Ralph Wilcox, who loves roads. And so he loves going out and surveying roads. And we do have several sections. We actually found another interesting section of the Lincoln Highway, that kind of same time period, 1910s, 1912, 15, in East Arkansas recently. But the military road, I know Peggy Lloyd did some research on several sections of that have been listed. In our website, you can go to National Register of Historic Places, and there's a search tool where you can plug in a name or a city or a county, and you can find all of those that are listed. So if you just type in road, it'll basically give you all the road segments that are listed in Arkansas.
The spelling of the name Arkansas, the W to the S, hold on now.
It's in the territorial period, it was just kind of whatever you wanted to do, it seemed like. It's from a Native American word, so I think it just, whatever transcribed way it did. By Arkansas law, there is a law that the legislature did enact, and I can't remember the year of it, but by law, we are Arkansas with a W at the end, but we are spelled with an S. So legally, you have to spell it with an S.
1929.
1929.
And the legislature thought it would sound a little more intellectual if it didn't spell the way we used it.
Yeah. So, and I've quoted that law several times in some stuff when it's like, well, they're spelling it W, but really, legally, we have to say S. So, but especially in the territorial period, when you're reading documents and stuff, spelling is kind of whatever they just decided they wanted it to be. So.
That would go back to like the French influence, or because you wouldn't pronounce that final consonant.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of these words, especially the words that we take as Native American words, they're Native American words translated into French, translated into Spanish, translated into, so we have lots of influence. So, I mean, Little Rock, Petit Roche, is what we get called for a large chunk of time, and even in some of the documents from the territorial period, we're known as like the Petit Roche, it's the Little Rock. And the Little Rock is actually, we think a piece of it is at the foot of Junction Bridge. Now it's been moved around a couple of times, but that's probably the rock that they are associated with. This little rock across from the ginormous rock bluff across the river. So.
That is what the distinction was one of the big rock ones.
Yeah. Yeah, so the big rock is the big, like.
When they brought keelboats down, they couldn't get on Big Rock. It was too high to get up the bluff. So they came down to where it was easier to park.
Yeah.
And they parked on the little rock, so it was just the right shape to park.
And there's a few accounts too of like you come around the river until you see this like little outcropping of rock, and so we just became known as Little Rock. There was a big controversy about Little Rock. As I said, James Miller was the one, the governor, who basically said, we got to move this capital, like, let's get out of Arkansas Post. Arkansas Post was never really seen as a great place. It was swampy, it was mosquito-y, it was, in the middle of nobody seemed to like it. So they wanted to move somewhere else. And Little Rock was a great place because they'd all bought land there. And they wanted to call it Arkopolis originally. There was this whole kind of, there were lots of land schemes and land trades going on in what became Little Rock. And the first 10 years of them settling Little Rock is basically court cases about, but I bought this land and you bought this land and it's really my land and that person sold this land 5 times and who actually owns it. So there were lots of scheming going on to be Little Rock too. They wanted a capital and everybody knew it would be expensive. The land would be of high value, so everybody wanted to own it. So there's all kinds of stuff going on at Little Rock in the 1820s.
Davidson, the woman,
Mm-hmm.
I know, it was a place at one point, and I think it was on the Black River.
I think so.
And there's nothing there left of it.
No, there's.
Davidsonville.
There's archaeological remains, as far as I understand, of some places, and I'm pretty sure that they've recently done a group in Arkansas has recently done like a recreation of what it might have looked like. There's online, if you search for Davidsonville, I think it's like a fly through. You can do like a 3D kind of rendering of it. I think it was a class project that a local college did. I haven't looked at it in a little while, so I don't know all the details. But yes, there was a settlement there, and it was very early. But it's kind of one of those ones like Cadron that just it never took hold, or there was a better site somewhere else when the railroad came through. So it's just like a lot of these early communities that just kind of died.
Well, they had a bunch of roads. We were up there doing a reenactment. I'm with the Early Arkansas Reenactment Association, and we were up there camping and helping with their park facility, kind of a little festival thing that day. And they've got where the roads were and where all the town people had their houses. And one of the sites has a pier, well, it's not pier, it's beam construction of just the
What it
frame
might have looked like.
of what, like a rendering picture. It's really pretty cool because you can look at it. It's a three-dimensional metal building without walls. Yeah, I think it's the post office, I believe.
It was the Cadron,
And it's kind of like the Woodruff Print Shop where they've recreated a territorial building. Cadron, there's a little state park there, or a local park, and they also have a building. It's a dog trot, big cabin, but it's been
Cadron
rebuilt.
Settlement is actually further up on Cadron Creek.
They put that
And
where
they
the kind of
wanted
park
to bring-
is.
Actually wanted to bring
This was
the state capital to Cadron, and there was a big fight between Cadron and Little Rock because of the land, all the land speculation.
Yeah.
And it actually moved here because it was
They
more
got a lot
central.
of signboards up there in Dawsonville.
Davidsonville.
Davidsonville, that you can read and it'll tell you where different
Where
things
the-
were. And I
where
believe
they
that
paid for it.
the Santa Andreas and whenever Harley's Ridge formed that day, when that thing popped up, everybody got scared and everybody in that town left.
It flooded
It
the
flooded that
town
town, and they
it
just
had
said,
to-
we're gone.
That's where everybody left.
There were people there up until the time that earthquake
The
happened.
earthquake, yeah.
That
Can
ridge
you imagine?
came into being and.
Get a question?
Does the number of historic sites go up in the staging period, 1836, 1860? We had a lot more sites that you talk about if you were talking about that.
Oh yes. I mean, as I said before, I think they're just not a lot of permanent. What people would consider permanent buildings that they're building in this period. It's settlement. We're here. We're throwing up something, and then maybe in 20 years, when we have money and we farm, we can build a brick building, or we can build a stone building, or we could build a timber frame building. So I think a lot of these just don't survive. And there is kind of a fallacy of we probably don't have the best stuff. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the house near Arkadelphia, the Barkman House, which was probably one of the best territorial houses that anyone ever saw, and it doesn't survive, so we don't know what it looked like. We don't have a drawing and that kind of thing. But between 1830 and the Civil War, we do have lots of sites in Arkansas that are associated with that. There's several homes. There's a couple of plantations, Lakeport was built just before the Civil War. There are also lots of family farmsteads and cabins from that period, right before the Civil War. There's not a ton of them. I mean, you're definitely going to find more in Mississippi or Alabama just because there's more settlement in that area earlier. But, it's that kind of fallacy of survival. The closer you get to the modern time period, the more buildings survive.
Okay, where does it, the Scott plantation?
Yes.
Where does it fit?
So it's going to be later. So basically in Arkansas, there are large plantations, kind of in this 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, but they're all on the Mississippi River or the Washita, or, maybe some on the White. We just don't, and as you said in your thing too, we also don't have those kind of large plantation kind of agriculture at all in Northwest Arkansas or parts of North Arkansas. It's just, there aren't rivers, there aren't big swaths of arable land. You just don't have that culture. But most of the plantations that we think of when we think, plantations like we would see in the movies are going to be on the Mississippi River because That's where the big land that you could get was, and it had a direct route to a trade route to somewhere else. And so like Lakeport is probably the best, if not the only, surviving pre-Civil War plantation house in Arkansas that was that kind of movie idea.
So Morrowscape is in development.
As far as I know, it's right after that time period, because we do have some large plantation houses that are built post-Civil War. There's several around Little Rock, and kind of out to the east, Scott, and kind of as you go that way. But most of them are actually post-Civil War. And it's still that idea of we own the land, we build big houses. It's just not slavery period big houses. Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the National Register of Historic Neighborhoods. Are you familiar with that? And do you know what the requirements are?
So the way that we deal with neighborhoods is they're still listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but they're called historic districts. Yeah, so same thing, and instead of listing one building, we also do this for farms, we also do this for large school properties. If it's basically more than one building, then we can list it as a district rather than doing an individual nomination for every single house. We would do it all at one time as a historic district. Little Rock, as far as I know, has like the most west of the Mississippi, I think, in terms of historic districts in a urban area, and that includes, Hillcrest, that includes Central High neighborhood, that includes the Dunbar neighborhood, the Governor's Mansion area, Park Hill up in North Little Rock, the Argenta district, South Main. There's a couple of other smaller ones that are scattered around as well. But it's a way that the National Register looks at it where we can do multiple buildings at one time rather than individually. And it's basically the same requirements for being on the National Register. They look at buildings that are usually older than 50 years. And for historic districts, they're looking to make sure that you have integrity as a neighborhood, or does it have historic integrity as a large area? So does it still kind of feel the same as it would have felt and looked when it was established? So like the Governor's Mansion area is about 1880 through 1920. That's kind of the time period they're looking at. Same thing for the Heights, or for the Hillcrest, 1890, 1900 to 1930 is what they're looking at there. So same kind of rules and regulations, it's just we can do a lot at once rather than just one place at once.
So the basic requirement is that that district has to be at least 50 years old?
At least 50 years old, have historic integrity. And there are a few other requirements. One of the things that we would do, if you called us about a historic district, we would go out with you and basically look at the boundary, and then we'd have to do a survey of that area. There's a specific way you do that for the National Park Service. And then write a nomination that would incorporate that boundary as why this is important. Does it have significance in some way? Is it significant for its architecture? Is it significant for the people who live there? Is it significant because something happened, like Central High? It's significant for the Central High crisis. So it has to have a reason to be important, and then it has to have historic integrity. So, and it's kind of hard to quantify that even more than that because everything's so different. We can't say it has to be, it has to be significant in these X number of areas. It could be significant for lots of reasons. So, but it's something that our office works with individuals on a case-by-case basis. So.
Mm-hmm. Which house you said is like at the beginning of your talk that it was built over a spring?
The Estevan Hall in Helena. Yeah.
Like the thing that pops into my house is like, do they have a big problem with mold? Over a spring like that?
I'm not sure if Estevan Hall ever did. The way that it was built is, if you'll remember the picture, it's kind of a large hall over a big foundation, and I'm pretty sure that bottom part was mostly open, and which is a very popular thing in the kind of French Creole tradition, is you'd have a lower floor that's basically open, like raised.
From the picture, it didn't look like it was a raised house.
Yeah, so it's on this big hill, and it's kind of stuck back in the hill, and then the bottom part of it, I think, was originally open. Now it's enclosed, and the spring has been kind of rerouted out the house. But originally it would have been most likely open, and then you would have gone up these grand stairs to the open hall on the second floor. So
That makes more sense.
yeah. I think they probably enclosed the spring with some sort of like spring box or something, so it would have been, not just open to the elements, but I'm pretty sure that lower floor would have been storage, open, air circulation, so which would have cut down on the mold issue. I mean, we have other examples of later revivals of that, French Empire, Second Empire, things like that in the 1900s. But for Arkansas, we just don't have those buildings that survive, and it's really the only thing that we know of. I mean, you get a lot more of it once you get into Missouri, and that's because they have a longer tradition of those kind of French settlements, St. Genevieve, St. Louis, these kind of places. And it just survives there when it doesn't survive in Arkansas. It just, either it's on the river and it falls in the river at some point, or it just doesn't survive for whatever reason, so.
I read, when I went to the visitor center, they called Trammel Hall.
At Trammel Hall is when it's here, yeah.
Yeah, that was the first
Or
brick
current.
house in Little Rock, and it was 1846, I believe, today. But everything else was log cabin. So that's why we don't have any of those pretty French houses.
Yeah, I mean, it's the French population was just, there were Arkansas Post, and all of that is gone. It just got,
French trappers, they didn't build anything.
yeah. So, and it's kind of amazing that it survives in Helena, because Helena got, part of it was taken out by the Civil War, like stuff happens and stuff falls in the river in Helena too. Like there's this whole occupation of Helena is long, and it's amazing that that survived in the same family for like 200 years. It's really fascinating. Yeah, or the kudzu ate it, which is half of Helena too. So, well, I think we're good. Thank y'all very much.
Okay, well, let's get going. Our final speaker today is Theo Witsell. He is the ecologist and chief of research for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission and the curator of the ANHC Herbararium. He has also worked as a contract botanist and ecologist for a number of government agencies and private organizations, including the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Department of Defense, the Tennessee Valley Authority, NatureServe, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Missouri State Parks, and the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Do you sleep?
Sometimes.
Okay. Let's see. He is co-editor of the Atlas of Vascular Plants of Arkansas and has authored or co-authored more than 30 scientific publications and book chapters. He is a native of Arkansas and holds a master's degree in botany from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. His research interests include ecology and conservation of rare plants and their habitats, restoration of degraded ecosystems, and anything to do with the grasslands of the southeastern U.S. He is also an avid native plant gardener. So, welcome Theo Witsell.
Thank you. So I got to start with a disclaimer, and that's that I'm not a historian, at least not in the sense that everyone else here is, and that I don't have a great deal of deep expertise in human history, but I am a natural historian and an ecologist, and I think I'm going to bring a little bit of a different kind of presentation than you've been getting today and that you might usually be accustomed to, and I hope that you find it informative. This is going to be a little bit faster paced, also to be shorter, version of a talk I gave at the Clinton School for Public Service at the beginning of this month as part of the speaker series there. So without delay, I'll get started. Thomas Nuttall is an important anniversary this year of his trip to Arkansas Territory 200 years ago this year. And he actually arrived in Arkansas, or what is today Arkansas, at the end of 1818 on December 27th, when he entered the waters of what is now Arkansas on the Mississippi River at the northern border of Mississippi County. He spent 13 months in Arkansas and Oklahoma, what was then Arkansas Territory, and published an account or a journal of his travels, which is an excellent read if you have not read it. I suspect most of you have. And I came up with this idea a few years ago. I knew the 200th anniversary of his trip was coming up, and there had not been a great deal of scholarship on reinterpreting the natural history observations that Nuttall made coming to Arkansas. There'd been quite a bit of good, fairly rigorous reinterpretation or context provided for the human history observations that he made. He was also functioning basically as an ethnographer, studying Native American culture, history, and language as he came through, but also, of course, he was a botanist and a naturalist, so he studied the plants and animals and habitats that he came across. And I wanted to reinterpret those natural history observations, start to finish, the entire book. Every time he makes a mention of a plant, animal, or habitat, I wanted to discuss that in terms of a modern context 200 years later. And I'll talk about a 100-year after sort of attempt to do this that also inspired me in a minute. But let's go back to 1818 and see what it was he was arriving to find. So Arkansas Territory at the time, of course, was Arkansas and most of present-day Oklahoma minus the northern band of counties and the Panhandle. And it was a very different place than it is today. He encountered a really wild landscape for all practical purposes. It was a vast, mostly forested, but certainly not entirely, and we'll get to that, landscape, most of it very little altered by the hand of humans. At that time, the 1820 census tallied 14,760 Indians and 14,267 settlers, including slaves. And that is not very many people to have exerted a lot of influence over the landscape. Hard for us to imagine what it must have been like, what he encountered. He also was the first really trained naturalist, especially botanist, to make collections here. Many of his specimens survive, 200 years old now, and I'll show a few of those. These are specimens that he gathered in Arkansas Territory. He described many new species, things that he discovered for the first time to Western science anyway, and wrote up. And this is a publication that came out a few years after his journey in 1837, which was the Collections Tour de Flora of the Territory of Arkansas, in which he tallied all the plants that he saw and described a number of new species to science and named them at that time. A little background on Nuttall. He was born in Long Preston, Yorkshire, England in 1786. He was not educated to the extent that I find most people assume he was. People think, oh, he was a doctor or professor, right? No, not exactly. He only went to formal school until he was 14. Had no college degree. He worked as a journeyman printer for his uncle, but had a passion for natural history. He wanted to be an explorer and make discoveries and see wild things and have a great adventure. And to pursue that, he went to America. He came in 1808, and he knew of a famous American botanist at the time, Dr. Benjamin Barton, who had authored the only textbook on North American botany at the time. And he couldn't find a copy. I believe it was out of print when he got here. But he sought out Dr. Barton and met him, perhaps at a lecture that public lecture that Dr. Barton was giving in Philadelphia, where Nuttall arrived. He impressed Dr. Barton, who assisted him in making some great connections. He got Nuttall some positions on expeditions as a botanist to the Great Lakes region in 1810 and another one up the Missouri River in 1811. In 1812, there was a little bit of an issue for Nuttall. The War of 1812 broke out in June, and he returned to England. He stayed in England for the entire duration of the war. And while he was there, he worked up a lot of the data and specimens he collected from his Missouri River expedition. He really made a name for himself in Europe with this scholarship, and was inducted into the Linnaean Society. It's a great botany professional association, and came back to the United States in 1815 as soon as he could. He made a couple of collection trips across the eastern U.S. in 1815 and 16, and then was inducted into a couple of the big scientific societies in the United States. He was pretty young, not just barely 32 years old, I think, 31 maybe, when he published his first North American flora, the Genera of North American Plants, which really cemented him as one of the top botanical scholars in the New World. He left Philadelphia, or he had set his sights on Arkansas Territory, and in October of 1818, he left Philadelphia alone, setting out for his big expedition to Arkansas. To finance his trip, he didn't have the money to do it himself. He sought donations from benefactors in these societies he was part of. And 4 members of the American Academy of Natural Sciences each gave him $50. So Nuttall, with $200 in his pocket, set out on a year-long expedition with no people helping him in the field. He traveled overland to Pittsburgh, where he descended the Ohio River in a skiff, which he purchased for $6. Nuttall had no experience piloting a boat whatsoever, and it becomes apparent quickly. He was fortunate to meet a young man, teenage boy, who had experience running a boat and took him on, gave him passage. And he sort of taught Nuttall how to pilot this boat. Later had a falling out, which is in the book, and Nuttall accuses them of trying to rob him. I mentioned that I got the inspiration, or some of the inspiration, to do this project by another botanist. His name was E.J. Palmer, Ernest Jesse Palmer. Palmer was a field botanist and plant collector for the Arnold Arboretum, which is Harvard University's Arboretum. But he lived in southwest Missouri near Joplin. And he spent a lot of the 1920s exploring the greater region of the United States, including Arkansas and Oklahoma. And in 1927, he published a journal article in a botanical journal, the Journal of the Arnold Arboretum, called On Nuttall's Trail Through Arkansas, in which he talks about 100 years after the fact, sort of reinterpretation of some of Nuttall's work. But it was very incomplete. He did not go through everything, and he also really focused on areas that he himself had spent time, but it's a great read as well if you're interested in the subject. On the portion of the trip from Philadelphia to Arkansas Territory, I don't concern myself in my research with the botanical observations that he makes because of the geography, but he talks about or you just get from reading his writing a bit of a picture of who Nuttall was. And to put it in modern terms, he was an absolute nerd. I mean, this guy was absolutely hyper-focused on his subjects. He had no real patience for things that would distract him from his work, but he was just a serious scientist and really wanted to get down to work. But there's some great quotes, and I'll read this one because it really is one of my favorites in the book. After proceeding about 2 miles below Beavertown, which is in Ohio, we landed in the dark and went to the tavern to which accident had directed us, but finding it crowded with people met together for merriment, we retired to a neighboring hovel in order to obtain rest and shelter from the weather, which was disagreeably cold. Our prospect of repose was soon, however, banished, as our cabin, being larger than the tavern, was selected for a dancing room. And here we were obliged to sit, waking spectators of this riot till after 1 o'clock in the morning. The whiskey bottle was brought out to keep up the excitement, and without the inconvenience and delay of using glasses, was passed pretty briskly from mouth to mouth, exempting neither age nor sex. Some of the young ladies also indulged in smoking as well as drinking of drams. Symptoms of riot and drunkenness at length stopped the dancing, and we now anticipated the prospect of a little rest. But in this we were disappointed by the remaining of one of the company vanquished by liquor, who, after committing the most degrading nuisance, which he doesn't specify what that was, at intervals disturbed us with horrid gestures and imprecations for the remainder of the morning. On relating in the neighborhood our adventure at this house, we were informed that his tavern was notorious for the assemblage of licentious persons. And there's a number of great quotes. He was also pretty disappointed, or unimpressed, we should say, with the average backwoods white settler, whom he found unindustrious and typically drunken. And there's another good quote here. About daybreak, we were accosted by a backwoods neighbor anxious for a dram of whiskey, which we had foreseen and provided for. We were detained all day by the wind, and the hunters went out in quest of turkeys. The improvidence of these hunting farmers is truly remarkable, annually mortgaging their produce for the meanest luxuries of civilized life, still destitute of flour, of the produce of the orchard, of country spirits, and indeed of coffee and sugar for a great part of the year, at the same time that they might become independent with even moderate industry. And that's a theme that Nuttall harps on through the book. There's a number of great quotes of that. When he got to Louisville, Kentucky, he traded or sold his little skiff. It was not adequate for the rest of his journey as the river got bigger, and bought a flatboat. He does not give a lot of background on what that boat was like. He never gives the dimensions or anything, but something along the lines of these illustrations. So a large flatboat probably had some sort of a shelter on one part and one single big oar out the back, and he does talk about the oar. He took along, as most of the travelers did on the Mississippi River at that time, as means of a guide, Zadok Kramer's Navigator, which Nuttall called the Pittsburgh Navigator. And if you have not investigated that work, it is a pretty interesting book that was published every few years around this period and gives sort of an updated account, or as updated as they could, of how to get down the river, where the navigational hazards were, and some very crude, almost cartoonish maps of the major sandbars, islands, bends, and so on. But keep in mind, the river at this time was completely unimpeded. It was unrestrained by the Corps of Engineers. Like today we have locks and dams and dikes, and they dredge the channel and clear out old trees and all this sort of stuff. None of that was going on at the time, so this river was very dynamic. It changed all the time. With every flood, a sandbar would move, there'd be banks caving in, courses cutting off, oxbow lakes being formed. So it was a really dynamic and exciting place to be, without a doubt. There's an old map that was in the first edition of Nuttall's journal, sort of shows pretty crude where he was. Now, part of the research that I wanted to do was to try to map as precisely as possible exactly where he was every day. And I've got a massive database of points. Of course, we have technology now that's allowing this to be done much more thoroughly and accurately than it's ever been before. Modern GIS technology, or geographic information science, allows us to overlay historic maps that have been georeferenced. In the case of this work, it was the original plat maps from the GLO survey, circa early 1800s, 1820s, 30s. With modern day aerial photography, you can see the old river bends a lot of times. Old place names. There's a neat marriage of history and geography involved in this exercise. And so I tried to kind of map out where he camped every night to the best I could. On the river portions of his journey, which was quite a bit of it, there weren't a lot of roads, so the rivers were the highways, was able to get pretty darn accurate in a lot of places. Now, when he went overland later in the trip into around Fort Smith and places, it becomes a little more fuzzy. But an interesting thing about this was how much the river has changed in the last 200 years. It might seem obvious. I first started out playing around with this using modern day maps, or the old topographic maps from the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. Very unsatisfying work, getting confused. Nothing made sense. He'd say, we went 10 miles, you go 10 miles, nothing matched up. And a few years ago, someone geo-referenced the original GLO maps. And that was a game changer in this exercise. So this is just an illustration of the Arkansas River, at which, of course, Nuttall came up, at Pine Bluff. So this is downtown Pine Bluff right here. There's an old channel of the river, which is just a lake today. You can see the river going up that way, flowing that way, down to the southeast. And there's a red grid imposed over this aerial photograph, which is a modern day 2006 photograph. And that's the original land survey. That's a mile by a mile grid, still in the same place it was during that original survey. And here's the original land survey map. So at that time, the river came all the way over to the Pine Bluff, which was an upland escarpment right here at downtown Pine Bluff, which is, you can see these things on the map today, but they were the old ones. And the big theme here is the river's a lot straighter than it used to be. And this is the river south of Little Rock. So there's the Little Rock Airport up at the top of the screen, and it's coming down pretty straight today, just a little bit of a swirl through here. But in Nuttall's day, a big meandering river. He talks about some of these bends and the narrow ribbon of land between the bends of the river. And of course, today you can see the big Oxbow Lake that was the channel at his time. So pretty neat exercise, really. The navigational hazards that he encountered were formidable, and he talks about them, especially in the context of his lack of experience as a boatman. Just a few to read quickly. A few miles below, however, and this was near Osceola, Arkansas, we observed the river contracted within a narrow space by a spreading sandbar or island and planted almost across with large and dangerous trunks, some of the tops and others with the roots uppermost in a perpendicular posture. The water broke upon them with a noise which I had heard distinctly for 2 miles, like the cascade of a mill race, in consequence of the velocity of the current. With all our caution to avoid them, the boat grazed on one, which was almost entirely submerged, and we received a terrific jar. And then there's a great quote. He had taken on 2 passengers to help him, with the journey in Louisville. He never mentions them fully by name, but he talks of a Mr. G, an elderly man, and his young son. Anyway, this is a great quote. We continued our voyage as usual at daylight, and floating with a brisk current down the right side of the 34th island, had nearly cleared ourselves of a host of snags and sawyers, when at last, puzzled on which side of one of these terrific objects to steer, we unfortunately struck it with considerable force, and the young man who accompanied us, the son of Mr. G, an amiable youth of 16, was precipitated headlong into the river, together with the steering oar, which was suddenly jerked off by the snag. Our boat was at the same instant careened over so far as to first appear overturning, but I instantly had the satisfaction to see that she was free, had received no injury, and that Edwin, on this emergency, could swim. And though much alarmed, had come within our reach and got safely on board. And, it wouldn't be bad to go on a swim on your trip down the Mississippi River, but this was New Year's Eve, so not the greatest. But you can see that he came down the Mississippi River, and then when he got to, he passed what's today Helena, right here at the mouth of the St. Francis. This is Crowley's Ridge coming down, and came up the White River. It took a little cutoff, which is still present today, more or less, into the lower Arkansas, and came up to Arkansas Post. So reconstructing this was one part of the research I've been doing. The other was reconstructing or interpreting all of the species that he talks about. Nuttall was a very good botanist, but you got to keep in mind the references he had to work with at the time were very poor. There's a lot of misidentification, bewildering applications of old names that are long archaic, not used today. So I have this great big spreadsheet with hundreds of species that he talks about. Sometimes he uses the Latin name of his day, or Latin name of something kind of similar to what he actually saw. Sometimes he uses a common name. And so I've got this big table that cross-references what he said he saw, what I think it was that he actually saw, and so on. It's been a pretty fascinating exercise. And then also on that spreadsheet, the date at which he saw it, the condition it was in, would have been in if it was flowering or in the wintertime or whatever, and the habitats he saw it in, the page number in the book, etc. I'm not going to go into great detail, I just don't have time, but I'm just going to kind of go through a few observations that he made, some modern day interpretation, and so on. This is a great quote. This was at the mouth of the St. Francis River, just north of present-day Helena, on the Mississippi. And he says, "I was greatly disappointed to meet with such a similarity in the vegetation to that of the middle and northern states." So he knew the flora of the northeast U.S., but he was still sort of confined to these big river bottoms. And so you're seeing the same common trees that are in those habitats from Louisiana up to Pittsburgh. So he's kind of bummed out on what he was seeing. The higher lands produce black ash, elm, hickory, walnut, maple, hackberry, honey locust, coffee bean, etc. On the river lands, as usual, grow platanus or buttonwood, upon the seed of which flocks of screaming parrots were greedily feeding. Also, enormous cottonwood trees, commonly called yellow poplar, some of them more than 6 feet in diameter, and occasionally festooned with the largest vines I had ever beheld. Here grew also the holly, Aplectrum hyamale, Botricium obliquum, and Fumaria aurea. Nearly all the trees throughout this country possessing a smooth bark were loaded with mistletoe. I'm not going to read all this, but just to show you, for that one paragraph that he described, it might take 2 or 3 pages to discuss all of the different things he might have seen. Some cases like black ash, we have no black ash anywhere near Arkansas, and didn't in Nuttall's day either. What he probably saw was the pumpkin ash, which is a species of the southern big river systems. But a couple of neat ones to interpret. Flocks of screaming parrots. Without question, he saw the now extinct American parrot, or the Carolina parakeet. It's been extinct for 100 years. Another one he mentions in the same passage, which is really fascinating, is Aplectrum hyemale. He called it Ophrys hyemale. Aplectrum hyemale is an orchid called the Adam and Eve orchid, and it's an orchid of high pH upland mountainous areas today, where we know it in Arkansas. Has beautiful flowers, no leaves when it flowers. He was there in January when he made this observation. It flowers in May, but in the winter it has a winter green leaf that's very distinctly white and green striped. It feels like leather or plastic almost, and it's heavily pleated. It's about this big, and there's no question that he was right, that he saw that. There's nothing else that looks like it. He absolutely was accurate. But today, it's known nowhere near where he was, which was in Phillips County, north of Helena there. What happened was he saw parts of the Mississippi alluvial plain of East Arkansas that there's none of it's left. He saw these higher terrace lands, all of which have been cleared for agriculture, nearly so. And they had these mountain plants on them, but today that's all gone. He spent a lot of time at Arkansas Post, with which he was none too impressed. He had a lot to say about what a odd place for a settlement that was, and so on. But he did have a great time going botanizing, as we call it today, going out and looking at plants and looking at animals and exploring the countryside. Arkansas Post, of course, I'm sure you've heard, you know about. You don't need me to tell you about it. But it is important to know these yellow shapes here are treeless prairies that were mapped in the original land survey. It's the southern tip of the Grand Prairie, which is the largest grassland, native grassland in Arkansas. And that, of course, grabbed Nuttall's attention. Unfortunately, he was there in the winter, so it's a little sad to not get a great report of all the cool plants that would have been in those grasslands. But he does talk about a few. He also talks a lot about the wetlands there. This is a neat map. It's some of the original land survey maps of Arkansas Post. Right in the center of this photo is an actual drawing of where the post was. This is Post of Arkansas. Today, that is long gone under the river. This is actually a georeference map, but the river has changed its place and taken all of that land away. There's, of course, the national park there on that peninsula that sticks down. This is a great quote from his time at Arkansas Post. He starts to talk about some of the animals that made an impression on him and the settlers. I was now obliged more deeply to wade through the enswamped forests which surround the habitable prairie lands in consequence of the late rain. In these ponds, I am told, the proteus or siren is occasionally met with. There are also alligators, though by no means numerous. And that was January 23rd. Of course, the alligator, we know what he was talking about. It was the American alligator. There's only one. And it was common in that area, no doubt, in his day. It's there again today, after probably an absence of time when it had been more or less wiped out in that area, but it is back. But what did he mean by the proteus or the siren? That's an interesting thing to think about. There are it was a giant salamander of some kind, and there are 3 species which were known, and still today probably known from that region. Those are the western lesser siren, the Red River mud puppy, and the 3-toed amphiuma, and these are big salamanders. They made an impression on the locals who told him about them. He doesn't mention seeing them himself, but these can range from a foot to 32 inches or something for a 3-toed amphiuma. I took this picture at Lake Conway, and if I had unraveled that thing, it would have been every bit of 2.5 feet long. So that's just kind of neat, one of the things he talked about. I've also made it a point to go to places that are left today that were most similar to what he saw when he was there. Places like the White River National Wildlife Refuge, where we still have bits of that giant bottomland system intact. Where a site like this is 7 miles across in this photograph is still wild, untamed river bottom. Places like this on the lower Cache River, Bayou de View, this is the largest tract of true ancient old growth bottomland cypress tupelo forest that we have probably in the state. Those large giant cypress trees that are super emergent, 130 to 140 feet tall, 800 to 1,000 years old. And the mid-story, or under the smaller trees underneath with the golden leaves in the photograph, are a cohort of water tupelo trees about 500 years old. So that's pretty impressive to what he saw. These were massive trees. Some of these cypress trees are 15 feet across in the butt and 8 foot across going up the trunk. These are in the lower White River. You can see there's someone standing at the bottom for scale in that bottom picture. And massive oak forests as well. And he talked about the giant cottonwoods. We still have some big cottonwoods, but I've never seen a 6-footer. But also, I want to use this research to talk about how things have changed. So, of the original bottomland lowland forests in the lower Mississippi Valley, about 90 to 92% of that has been completely taken out, been drained, cleared for agriculture and so on. East Arkansas, where Nuttall came through, a lot of it looks like this today. It's all either aquaculture or agriculture. The original rivers and streams have been turned to ditches, and the original biodiversity that he saw is gone. But we still have some big chunks like the Big Woods, the largest tract of bottomland forest left in Arkansas, about 500,000 acres on the lower White, lower Arkansas area. Still have a couple scraps on Crowley's Ridge where he came to the base of when he got to what's now Helena, like this old growth beech magnolia tulip poplar forest, St. Francis National Forest. He also talked about the original grasslands, which we had over 1 million acres of treeless prairie mapped in Arkansas at the time of 1830 or so. And that would have been of immense interest to botanists or anyone interested in natural history. The largest is the Grand Prairie in eastern Arkansas, but we had a lot of others as well in different parts of the state. We will talk about these in the Western River Valley. He spent a lot of time there once he got around Fort Smith and talked a lot about those prairies. But the Grand Prairie, unfortunately, again, in the winter, here a vast prairie opens to view like a shorn desert, but well covered with grasses and herbaceous plants. These are pictures of remnant prairies that are still left, little scraps. 99.9% of the original prairie in the Grand Prairie has been destroyed. Many of the remaining remnants are owned by the Natural Heritage Commission, and you can go look at these. He also talked about another type of grassland, the Big River sand grasslands, most of which are gone today as well. This is actually on the Red River in southwest Arkansas, which he did go to, but just to serve as an illustration of what he would have seen along these big rivers. Sand dunes, something like you would associate with a beach ecosystem, scattered clumps of today very rare plants. Most of these have been lost. Also animals that are found only on these, like the least tern or whole suite of rare tiger beetles that live on these grasslands, and rare plants, which Nuttall would have been looking for. And what happened to these sandbars is they were lost as a consequence of us taming these rivers. They depend on flooding, redistribution of sediments, rivers changing course, and that is all out of the picture today for almost all the rivers. This was at Little Rock. In fact, this photograph was taken at the top of a smokestack, which was at the trolley barn in Little Rock, which is now the parking lot of the the Department of Arkansas Heritage Office. And you're looking west, that's the Bering Cross train bridge, circa 1900. Big giant sandbar in the river there, this sand grassland. You can see Big Rock Bluff on the right side and Pulaski Heights on the left. One day they were out there with a bucket lift to change light bulbs in the parking lot at Department of Heritage. And I said, hey, let me run up in that real quick and put me over the foundation of that smokestack. I want to take this picture again. And so they did that. And this is the modern day photograph. Of course, it's a lot of vegetation in the foreground, but that river train bridge is still on that's the same place it was. And you can look at Big Rock Bluff and Pulaski Heights in the background. It's exactly how it was. But no sandbar, right? Where'd the sandbar go? Well, it's gone. Look at the difference between the height of the river under the bridge today and back then. It's a lake now, basically. And that sandbar's been dug away to make a navigation channel for the boats. So that's the story of our sandbars, except on the lower Arkansas River, way down south, on the lower part, about 40 miles of that river are still wild and they still meander and we still have sandbars. The navigation project, they dug a canal from about Arkansas Post over to the White River. There's a lock and dam on either side, and that's the way the boat traffic goes. And they just left this part alone. So you can go down there. It takes a several day trip to really explore it. but to get down and see what Nuttall saw on those big river sandbars. We have sandbars still 1,000 acres with big, hundreds of acres of grassland and bare sand down on these areas. It's absolutely excellent natural habitat. We can see this is an infrared photograph taken from the air of all the different textures and colors of habitat. It's just amazing. Nuttall talks a lot about the wind on these rivers being a barrier to his trip. I'm not going to read all these, but he has all these quotes about they didn't go anywhere that day because the wind was too high. And I wanted to experience this and see what it was like. And I had the opportunity a couple years ago to join a group of ichthyologists. The ichthyologists are fish scientists. And as is the case with all these big river ecosystems, many of the species are very rare. They're in great peril, really. Things like the alligator gar, which can get 8 to 10 feet long, pallid sturgeon, paddlefish, some of these rare big river fish are of great research importance. So I got to accompany them on a trip on the lower Arkansas. They took me down in a boat, and they were studying these fish. And I, of course, was looking at sandbars and forests and other things. These are paddlefish here that they were catching. It's a great trip. But on this trip, we camped on one of the big sandbars, and this was where Nuttall camped, or as close as you can be today, because of course the river shifted, but he was within probably a half a mile of this site. This is one of those big sandbars. And we get there, and here's a quote from Nuttall. "We came to for the night on a sandbar opposite the center of the island, resembling an Arabian desert." And that's kind of what this was like. But we get out there, and I start to set up my tent, and the wind picks up, and the wind is really incredible. And I actually set up my tent, I put stakes in the ground and everything, and I turned around to go back to the boat and get my sleeping bag, and I hear some yelling, and I look, and all the ichthyologists are pointing and laughing, and my tent took off like a kite, and my tent is going off through the air. It lands on the sandbar and starts rolling like a tumbleweed towards the river. I'm screaming and chasing after it, you know. They're all laughing at me. And they showed me, after I caught the tent, the way they do this. They always take extra big buckets for their fish work, and they fill them full of sand and tie those to the base of their tent. And that's how they overcome this wind, which was like Nuttall had. Nuttall also gets into some great ethnobotany observations. This is the study of how humans use plants. And one of the great quotes, this is one of my favorites, was he got an audience with someone named Hackathon, which he described as a chief of the Quapaw. This was near Pine Bluff. And he has this quote: "This morning I observed the wife of the chief preparing for her family a breakfast from the nuts of the Siamus, or Nelumbium. They are first steeped in water and parched in sand to extricate the kernels, which are afterwards mixed with fat and made into a palatable soup. The tubers of the root, somewhat resembling batatas or sweet potatoes, when well boiled, are but little inferior to the farinaceous potato and are penetrated internally and longitudinally with from 5 to 8 cavities or cells." Well, the plant he was talking about is the American lotus. This is our largest native wildflower. The flower can be about the size of a dinner plate. And you probably recognize the fruit. If you don't know it, even in the wild, it's common in dried flower arrangements to use the lotus fruit. And these are the nuts inside those chambers that he talked about she was preparing as a food source. And if you take, and this is the plant, you know, it's a marsh plant. It grows in big river marshes, these big open water marshes that are flooded for part of the year. And this is the root, taken and cut in cross-section. You can see the cavities he was talking about, and this was boiled and cooked. He was so ecstatic when he finally made it out of 4 months in the river bottoms all the way up to mountainous terrain. When he got to Little Rock and saw the hills, he was just elated. There's some great quotes in the book about, I don't have one here unfortunately, a real poetic, waxing poetic about what he was seeing. About 8 miles from Mr. Curran's appeared again on the left very considerable round-topped hills. One of them, called the Mamel, in the distance where first visible, appeared insulated and conic like a volcano. I thought that was really funny because I learned growing up that Pinnacle Mountain was a volcano, which of course is not. But every kid of my generation, and probably their parents, learned in school that that was a volcano. At least I remember a teacher telling me that. But he was talking about Pinnacle Mountain, which of course is west of Little Rock. And he has a great quote that really inspired me to go looking for somewhere. That's this cliffs bordering the river, broken into shelvings, were decorated with red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, and clusters of ferns. Well, he was talking about being right on the banks of the Arkansas River and these bluffs coming down. I was like, I can go find that place. Well, I started to look at the map, and I didn't see anywhere on the Arkansas River that had bluffs in the area he talked about. And that's because he was on the Arkansas River, but today the river's changed course, and here's where the story. So this is the Maumelle River. It comes out of Lake Maumelle, and it flows there's about a 2-mile stretch of it that flows down here into Arkansas. The mouth is way down here today. In Nuttall's time, the Arkansas River captured that whole lower 2 miles. So he was actually on these bluffs here, which are in Pinnacle Mountain State Park on the Maumelle River today. And so I grabbed my family one day and said, we're going to go find Nuttall's Bluff. And so we put in at the boat ramp on the Maumelle River, Pinnacle Mountain, and there was much whining. And we went out, and they had a great time once we got out, of course. That's just getting them out. And we found Nuttall's Bluff. It was without question. He was at these 2 bluffs that were right there, and got to exploring them, and they were very much like, they're still today just like they were when he was there. This is my interpretation of what we saw. But his ferns, which he just called clumps of ferns, were 3 species: the marginal wood fern, the woolly lip fern, and the blunt-lobed cliff fern, all of which are desert-adapted ferns that grow on rock outcrops and bluffs. And they were all there today. In fact, it looked just like it did, with the exception of a large band of Japanese honeysuckle on the lower, probably 10 feet band of the bluff, which of course was not there in Nuttall's day. He came back a couple days later to the same bluff. He said, amidst these wild and romantic cliffs and on the ledges of the rocks where moistened by springs grew a cruciferous plant, or mustard, very closely allied, if not absolutely the same, with the brassica napus, or rapeseed of Europe, and beyond all question indigenous. We know that he saw this plant, which is very rare today. It's found only in Arkansas. It's the Arkansas cabbage, or Arkansas twistflower, and it still grows on the bluffs there in Pinnacle Mountain. Beautiful plant, showy. He saw it not in flower yet. He saw the leaves, which look just like the mustards, cultivated mustards. And this is its entire range in the world. A few counties here in Arkansas, and of course he saw it there in Pulaski County where those red dots are. He then went to Cadron settlement, which he also was very unimpressed with. Said it was a fool place to build a settlement, not in so many words, but that's basically what he got at. And he did enjoy the botany, though. He said, in the course of the day, I amused myself amongst the romantic cliffs of slaty sandstone which occupy the vicinity of the Cadron. Here I found vestiges of several new and curious plants, and among them a new and undescribed species of Eriogonum, which is an umbrella plant, a desert species of the Southwest. With a considerable root, partly the color and taste of rhubarb, the petalostemons, and several plants of the eastern states, etc. The cactus ferox of Missouri, remarkably loaded with spines, appears to forebode the vicinity of the Mexican desert. If you go to Cadron, there are still some vestiges of the bluffs that are in decent condition, that haven't been messed up too bad. But it's a park, and a lot of it where he was looks like this today, and the flora has not done well. But if you get off into the back areas, and especially I went downstream and have explored a number of bluffs within a mile or two of where he was, you still find the plants he talks about. This is his specimens of the new Eriogonum, which he described as Eriogonum longifolium, the umbrella plant. This is it in flower. There's the leaves. He talks about the petalostemons, or the prairie clovers. He would have seen this species for sure, the white prairie clover, and likely the purple prairie clover. He did mention them in plural, indicating he saw more than one. And his cactus ferox was the western prickly pear cactus, which is still present there around the Cadron on the bluffs. Remarkably loaded with spines indeed. He also makes a really interesting animal observation at this point of his journey. He says, wild cats of 2 kinds, both striped and spotted, as well as panthers, bears, and wolves, black and gray, are in considerable abundance in this country. The bison, improperly called buffalo, is also met with occasionally in the distance of about a day's ride towards the Ouachita. Interesting, he talks about 2 cats and then the panther. That's 3 cats. Today we just claim the panther and the bobcat Now, bobcats can be spotted or striped depending on time of year and what you're looking at and how old the cat is, and just variation within a species in their pattern. But in Nuttall's day, we had ocelots in Arkansas as well. In fact, there is a form, or back then they would have called it a race of ocelot, a pale form, that the type locality or the specimen from which that species was described came from Arkansas, from southwestern Arkansas. So it's possible that he was talking about ocelots, that people he encountered knew ocelots. They probably occurred throughout at least the southwestern part of the state 200 years ago. Or maybe he was talking about bobcats in both cats. He talks about panthers and wolves. We would have had the red wolf at that time, bears. And of course, we still have many of these. There's no question with the advent of modern game cameras that's ended the debate on whether or not we have mountain lions. They are certainly here. The question is just, are they breeding? He talks about bison and saw them in western Arkansas and Oklahoma. He went up Petty Jean Mountain. It's a great quote that I love from Petty Jean. Toward the southern extremity of the ridge which I ascended, there are several enormous masses of rock, so nicely balanced as to almost appear a work of art. One of them, like the druidical monuments of England, rocks backward and forwards on the slightest touch. I found that rock, and you can move it with one finger. I actually found it before I read Nuttall in 1997. I was on Petty Jean Mountain with Bill Shepard. I was an intern at the Natural Heritage Commission, and Bill and I were up there at Stouts Point, which is the eastern end of the mountain, part of the state park, and also on the property of Camp Mitchell up there. The Episcopal Church owns Camp Mitchell. And we were walking along, and there was on top of the bluff, and there was large bare rock sections of the bluff, and I went to step out onto one of these, and the whole thing moved. And I, terrified, jumped back, but it only moved about an inch and stopped. And cautiously, I put one foot out on it and was able to rock this whole section of bluff, which in my memory was bigger than this room. Maybe it wasn't quite that big, but back and forth with just my foot. And I can't imagine that I was anywhere else except for the same place Nuttall was right in that area. And I went back looking for it once and haven't found it, but I'm going to go up there this winter and find it again. He also says, on the shelvings of this extremity of the mountain, I found a new species of anemone. That's where he was, April 4th. There's these stacks of rocks. There's the anemone specimen he made. That is the 10-petal anemone. It's still there today. He also gets into talking about grasslands in a major way. He's coming up the Arkansas Valley. He's getting into the big grassland country of that area. This is Sebastian, Franklin, Logan County. Yellow is open prairies as of 1830, land survey. The plat maps show this large one. This is the garrison, or Fort Smith. And there, just to the northeast, is Garrison Prairie on the original GLO plat map. He spent a lot of time there. It's 100% of it's gone today. That's in the middle of Fort Smith. There are some prairies just south of Fort Smith still today, like Cedar Prairie. There's some remnants of the original grassland. I don't have time to read too much about all these, but just to say he spent a lot of time. He talks about crossing these ridges south of Fort Smith on his way to Sugarloaf Mountain. He calls them tiresome ridges, and they were awful to go through, and the reason being they were scrubby oak savanna at that time. Something that looks like this. This is that same area today. Would have been more open, but lots of shrubby blackjack oak bushes with lots of hard old branches still on them. There's a great quote here, southwest of Fort Smith. Yesterday I took a walk of about 5 miles up the banks of the Podo and found my labor well repaid by the discovery of several new and undescribed plants. In this direction, the surface of the ground is gently broken or undulated and thinly scattered with trees, resembling, in this respect, almost a cultivated park. The whole expanse of forest, hill, and dale is now richly enameled with a profusion of beautiful and curious flowers. Among them, most conspicuous was the charming daisy of America, of a delicate lilac color, and altogether corresponding in general aspect with the European species. Intermingled appears a new species of Collinsia, a large flowered Tradescantia, various species of phlox, the Verbena oblitea, and the esculent Scilla. To interpret for the modern audience, this is what he would have seen. This is a remnant, old-growth post-oak savanna and prairie. This is on Fort Chaffee Military Base, which is the best natural area left in Arkansas, in my opinion. It still has It's things just like Nuttall described. Absolutely incredible. These are the same species he saw around the time he was there. This is an aerial view of a mosaic habitat like he described, where he had these open oak savannas that look like a park, these open grasslands, these forests in the ravines and so on. Moving out, this is on Fort Chaffee here. The species he talks about, the western daisy was his daisy of America. His new species of Collinsia is now Collinsia violacea, the violet Collinsia, still present in some of the prairie remnants out there. His verbena was the rose verbena, Glandularia canadensis. I've seen this by the millions in a year following a burn on Fort Chaffee in the woods, in prairies there. Several species of spiderwort he would have seen out there. Phloxes, several species again. His esculent scilla was probably the wild hyacinth. He certainly saw this one, which is the common species, but he also no doubt saw this one, which today is known from 3 places in Arkansas. It's the prairie camas. It would have been in the prairies. In fact, 2 of the sites are in prairie remnants on the south side of Fort Smith. I feel certain, based on the date, that at least some of what he saw was this species. Wonderful other descriptions. I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to say he talked about fire, lots of fire in the landscape. Native Americans burning, annual burning employed by the natives for the purpose of hunting with more facility and of affording a tender pasturage for the game. These grasslands are dependent on fire, and he talks a lot about that. This is a landscape like he saw on Fort Chaffee. He talks about barren areas in the prairies. That's not artificial. Those are saline flats. They're alkali, barrens of salty soil, natural, and this prairie and savanna in the background. These landscapes were just like Nuttall saw, except it's on the bombing range. So you're out there, and there's the fire started by things, but you might run into blown up tanks, which of course would be the only difference when Nuttall was there. But around those, you're stepping on the rarest plants you've ever only read about in books, as they're so rare. And the rarest plants are sometimes well guarded by unexploded grenades and things like that. So you gotta watch your step. He talks about Indian paintbrush covering the prairies, which is a prairie species of plants, and the shooting star, etc. I'll end shortly, but I just wanted this is another one I have a personal connection to this observation of Nuttall. He talks about being in the prairies around Fort Smith, and he says, amongst other objects of nature, my attention was momentarily arrested by the curious appearance of certain conic hillocks, about 3 feet high, generally situated in denudated places, and covered over with minute pebbles. These, on closer examination, proved to be the habitations of swarms of large red ants, who entered and came out by 1 or 2 common apertures. That sounds really interesting. What he saw, without question, were the nests of the western harvester ant. Now, this is an ant that was not known from Arkansas in modern times. We have another rare species of harvester ant in southwest Arkansas in sand barrens, but it makes about a 1-foot high mound and doesn't clear out 3-meter or 3-yard wide clearings and so on. Like this one does. But without question, this is what he saw. And there was a researcher at University of Arkansas Monticello doing research on the other harvester ants that I was just talking about. And I got to talking to him, and I said, do we have any sites for the western harvester ant? He said, no. He said, it's in Oklahoma, but in Texas, but we don't have any records. There's no record of it ever being in Arkansas. I said, you need to read Nuttall. And I gave him, I sent him the quote, and he got excited. I said, listen, there's habitat like that at Fort Chaffee. You need to go look. And he got permission to go to Fort Chaffee and went out there and found them. And so we have records where Nuttall, in the vicinity of where Nuttall was. And these are those covered in pebbles. And that photo was taken, this photo was taken on Fort Chaffee of the large red ants, just like Nuttall talks. And he goes on and talks about new species that he found. One of them is this Nuttall's pleat leaf, which was described for Nuttall. It's a beautiful rare species in the iris family. It's only found in prairies and open grasslands. It's still present in these remnants. Blooms for about an hour in the evening. It's akin to irises, about the size of a $50 flower. Talks about blue-eyed grass covering the prairies. Talks about the beautiful false indigos or beans and peas, including this one, the prairie torch, which still occurs in a few places in massive stands in these unplowed prairie remnants. We just bought this site It's an addition to Flanagan Prairie Natural Area. It's the largest population I've ever seen of this uncommon flower. And I'll just end it with this. I'm at time. He talks a lot about a friend that he made in Fort Smith, who is the physician there at the fort. His name was Dr. Russell. A young man like Nuttall himself, his early 30s, or actually I think he was in his 20s. And he was interested in natural history, and he would go with Nuttall on these day trips that he would make and collect plants and study these animals. And when Nuttall, he came through Fort Smith a couple of times. So he went to Fort Smith in May and June, and then he went into Oklahoma for several months. He came back in the fall, and when he got back in the fall, he discovered that his friend Russell had died. Russell had gotten sick and died. And he has this passage where he says, oh, I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. I'm going to skip this one and get to the one about Dr. Russell. Okay. It is with satisfaction, clouded with melancholy, that I now call to mind the agreeable hours I spent at this station, while accompanied by the friendly aid and kind participation of Dr. Russell, whose memory I have faintly endeavored to commemorate in the specific name of a beautiful species of Monarda. And he goes on poetic about him dying and his poor mother and so on. But this is the plant he described. It's a beautiful species of mint. Monarda russelliana is the name of it, named by Nuttall, and it's still present in the better quality habitats in the vicinity of Fort Smith. This is Russell's death announcement, a memorial to him, August 24th, 1819, 27 years old when he died. And I'll just leave you with a few pictures of what these prairies look like in May and June when Nuttall was there. There's a lot more in the published version of this research, which I'm planning at this point to release as a series of a serial article sort of a thing in a botanical journal called Phytoneuron. It's an online journal. It's open source. There's no page charges. You don't have to have a subscription to read it. Anyone who's interested will be able to download it from the internet. And I'm looking right now at least 3 lengthy, heavily illustrated articles with these photos and more that will be next year available for free to anyone who wants to see them. There may also be a book, but that's being discussed. Thank you.